one way of understanding a very brief counter-history of fascism that I'll outline.
I think it's extremely important, given the circumstances that we're currently living in, that we understand the history of fascism, the fact that it was not defeated in World War II, but rather recuperated by the imperialist forces and redeployed internationally by Western intelligence services in an ongoing war against communism. And the obvious growth of fascism around the world is related, of course, to capitalism's inability to overcome its internal crises, as well as its failure to defeat its ultimate enemy, which is socialism and the global working class movement. I'm sure most of us know that in 2021, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning Nazism. And of course, the US and Ukraine voted against it, while a few countries, mainly US allies, ended up abstaining. It has also come out, as Etilio Boron, who I know is affiliated with the IMG, just recently detailed that there were internal documents that have been leaked that demonstrate the plans for the US use of Ukraine in a proxy war against Russia and, of course, ultimately China, predated the war itself by years. And so a further investigation into this deep history of the US imperialist core using fascist forces as its ongoing war against communism, I think is extremely important. Of course, this goes back. Douglas Valentine, one of the leading specialists on the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, has written that the CIA has been developing fascist assets in the Ukraine for some 70 years. And we know that the Ukraine is an international hub for this global project. Moreover, we also know that fascism is on the march in the imperialist core, right? We see this, of course, in the country that I'm currently based in the United States, but we've seen it across Europe. And in fact, after I wrap up my comments, I'll share, if I can, two maps of Europe in 1988 and Europe in 2022, where we see the disappearance of the red countries in the East, and we see fascism on the march from Orban to Meloni to, the Le Pen movement in France, even though it hasn't taken power, is still a very powerful organization, and so forth. So we need to understand what fascism is, how it's rooted in the history of capitalism, and in particular moments of capitalist crisis, and how its principal enemy is socialism. And we have to also study the history of how to fight and win against fascism. I'll mention just very briefly in passing, there was a 2019 resolution by the European Parliament that's very important to know about, and it's gotten a lot of discussion within the European left, but not so much, at least that I've seen, within North America and beyond. And that is a resolution that basically solidifies a revisionist position that equates fascism with communism and, quote, condemns all manifestations and propagation of totalitarian ideologies such as Nazism or communism. So the position of the European Union is explicitly anti-communist and explicitly revisionist in identifying fascism with communism. The last thing that I'd say is that there's a series of laudatory goals that conclude the manifesto, all of which I completely support. But they leave me with a fundamental question, and that is, how can we best practically implement or achieve some of these goals? And I think that while discussions like the ones that we're having are extremely important to this orientation, we also have to find ways of practically connecting them even more concretely to important organizations that can build collective power, parties, unions, and various organizations. So for me, moving forward, a crucial question for the early 21st century, and this again is from my perspective within the kind of global north, is that of socialist reconstruction. How can we, as inheritors of many parties and organizational structures that have an unfortunate history of social chauvinism in certain cases, or reformist agendas in others, how can we, in moving forward, further develop parties and organizations that actually build working class power in the struggle against imperialism, the struggle for peace, the struggle for socialism? And in order to do that, I think that we have to really confront the anti-state, anti-party mantra that is the dominant ideology of the professional managerial stratum within the imperialist core, and arguably even more broadly than that. And so I'll conclude by saying that if we don't want to condemn ourselves to being canaries in the coal mine, singing beautiful songs of liberation until it all blows and the lights go out, we need to be working to develop powerful, practically oriented working class organizations that are anti-imperialist, pro-peace, and aimed at saving the planet and people before it's too late.
Fascism, as it's often understood in contemporary discourse, at least from a liberal perspective, by which I mean, of course, defenders of political liberalism, not liberals versus conservatives, it's a kind of moral position where there are these horrific individuals who say really bad things and should be condemned, and there's a kind of individualization of fascism, often at the expense then of systemic analysis of its modes of organization and emergence. And usually from the liberal perspective then, what's claimed is that even if these individuals are abhorrent, we should nonetheless tolerate them because they have a platform as well as anyone else, because we live within liberal democracies in which everyone has the right to free speech, etc. Now, if you actually look at the material history of fascism as it emerged, there are a number of important factors to be aware of. One is that it emerged within liberal democracies, not in strict opposition to them. In the case of fascism, strictly speaking, within Italy and Mussolini's black shirts, there was a development that worked first and foremost through the party system. There were important moments at which they broke with the kind of apparatus or system of liberal rule. They were also funded by MI5, so they had support from the British Secret Service. And that this was the model then for the Nazi rise of power. And how did the Nazis come to power? They didn't come to power by some dictatorial seizure of state power. They came to power through elections, right? In both cases, at the very end of that process, there's a very quick shift in the constitutional state. So the constitutional state is used as a means. Once enough power is obtained, then that's shifted, and very quickly then the liberal state or certain aspects of it are dismantled. What this means is historically, liberalism is not a bulwark against fascism. Liberalism is the seedbed of fascism. And we see this perhaps most clearly in relationship to the dominant ideological trope concerning the United States and the kind of contemporary history of the world. The United States and their Western allies were not opposed to fascism. They were working with, selling arms to, selling tanks, or selling engines for tanks to the Nazis and working with Mussolini. Alan Dulles, the one of the founding directors of the CIA, of course, famously said during World War II, "We're fighting the wrong enemy." And what he meant by that is that we're fighting the Nazis when we should be fighting the communists, and went about orchestrating behind the scenes an attempted pact with Hitler Germany in order to exit the alliance with Soviet communism and thereby take the Nazi Party in the direction of an alliance with the United States. And this is not just some bizarre moment in history. Alan Dulles had a whole series of meetings with top Nazi officials, and then after the Second World War, the CIA, the OSS, which is the predecessor organization of the CIA, through the work of Alan Dulles and many others, then established the major rat lines for the Nazis and the fascists, leading them, often through the work of the Vatican, to Latin America, and at least the numbers vary on this. There were 1,600 Nazi scientists who were brought directly into the United States through Operation Paperclip, many of whom were given academic jobs. And there were approximately, around 10,000, the numbers vary, it's hard to know for certain, other Nazis who were brought directly into the United States, as well as direct pushback against the Nuremberg trials in order to make sure that Nazi officials who worked very, very high and were very close with Hitler were either distributed through the rat lines or brought into the US. And then one of the most remarkable stories is the history of the German Secret Service, which was a Nazi official in charge of the Eastern Front under the Nazis. He was brought into the US, trained by the CIA, and then put back in charge of the German Secret Service in the post-war era. So the idea that the so-called liberal democracy of the United States waged war on fascism in order to save the world from the kind of cataclysmic nature of what Hitler and Mussolini were doing is not tenable at a historical and material level. And of course, I'm going very, very quick here, but there's probably 100 books that I could point you to, and documents from the CIA and from the US administration itself, as well as firsthand testimonies, right? Many of these figures are actually proud of what they did, because who fights communists better than fascists? That was the MO of the entire beginning of the Cold War. That's why they were recruited and set back up within Germany. That's why they were recruited and set back up within Italy. We needed to fight communism at all costs because communists are anti-capitalist. Right? In fact, there's a great quote by Alan Dulles where he says, well, the Nazis are pro-capitalist Aryan Christians, whereas the true enemy was the godless communism and its resolute anti-capitalism. Right? That kind of sets the tenor. Alan Dulles is probably the single most important political figure of the 20th century, given the power that he had over the entire US administration and their imperial endeavors in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So he's not a small potato. Combined with that, if we look at the history of US politics since World War II, there has been meddling and interference in over 80 foreign elections, overthrowing of 50 foreign governments, the majority of whom were democratically elected, dropping bombs on 30 countries. So anyone who flat-footedly asserts that the United States is a liberal democracy that's protecting us against fascism doesn't understand very fundamental elements of the recent history of the United States. And of course, a lot of this is due to the stockpile of amnesia, because what I'm saying probably sounds a little bit surprising, but it shouldn't when you actually think about it. If we had educational systems that focused on the material history of political bodies like the United States, then this would all be common knowledge and we wouldn't even have to have this conversation. Instead, of course, we have history books that completely elide these topics or eradicate these elements from history. So all of this leads me to raise a question that I would like for all of us to discuss, think about, and try to unpack, and that is, if liberalism and fascism historically are not opposites, is there a way of understanding them actually as modes of governance that might have a fundamental compatibility? A compatibility in the sense that liberalism functions in harmony with the history of global capitalism. That's how it emerged as a political system. And that we might want to understand fascism as a mode of governance for capitalism under threat. Meaning, it's a mode of governance that is deployed at times at which people push back against the capitalist system, or, and this might be pushback in the sense of immediate direct resistance, or it might just be spontaneous pushback because your life is so destroyed that there's no other option but to try to resist it in some way, shape, or form, because the fascist mode of governance tends to be used on the poor, underclasses, and subalterns of the world. Right? In this sense, then, if we try to understand it in this way, then we'd have to look at how the very idea that there's a central government that is structured in such a way that we could label it as a democracy, right? This is one of the debates today is the democracy of the United States being stolen by fascists or disappearing or something like this. I think that what we actually have to understand is that the way in which modes of governance operate is there might just be different levels of nested governmentality in which the prison industrial complex, as it operates within the United States, you'd be hard-pressed to describe it as anything other than fascist. It's a fascism orchestrated against targeted populations, which are largely poor populations of color. Right? The work of ICE, the fact that over 1,000 individuals, all of them poor, many of them demographically Native American, Black, Brown, etc., Latino, the fact that over 1,000 are killed by the police every year, and that this surpasses statistically many of the years of the lynching campaigns in the South, would suggest that, well, the way in which policing operates in the United States is also a fascistic mode of governance for the poor and for anyone who pushes back against it. In this regard, then, and I just want to keep an eye on time because I don't want to go on too long, I would I'll just add a few more things for us to think about, and that is that if it's indeed the case that there's not an oppositional structure between liberalism and fascism, but instead the possibility that they would operate as harmonious, but how to put it, they would be modes of governance in tension, a bit like the good cop and the bad cop. Right? The good cop of liberalism says you have all your rights, the bad cop of fascism comes in as soon as you exercise those rights in such a substantive way that they actually put the system under threat, right? The history of the evacuation of the occupied sites is a great example. We all have the freedom to peaceably assemble until it goes on too long and the state decides through Homeland Security that they want to get these, dirty leftists out of the way, and then they do it. If we understand it in these terms, then I think that we also have to rethink the conceptual pillars of liberalism that tend to dominate the mass media debate on our understanding of fascism. So I'll be very quick in this regard, but I'd love to return to some of these. Free speech is one of the major pillars. David's piece is excellent on this, and I also have a piece on this, so I won't say a lot, except for that one of the things that free speech avoids is the question of power. Right? The fact that you would have formal rights to something shouldn't do anyone. What really matters is if you have the substantive right to the power of having your voice broadcast and heard. That's why a whole series of figures have been invited to university campuses, is because they have the right to speak. They can do their crazy neo-eugenicist speech on a soapbox on the corner, at least according to the kind of framework of a liberal, quote-unquote liberal democracy. They don't have the right to a university megaphone, right? So the question is about power, not about speech. Secondly, the issue of violence, and here I very strongly agree with what David was saying. There's a kind of aesthetics of violence that we really have to be attentive to. That is that the violence that is visible is the infinitesimal violence of those whose dissent is being denigrated by the status quo. It is the tiny grains of sand that certain people put in the massive machinery that is the corporatocracy and global capitalism. What is rendered invisible in this aesthetics of violence is that system itself. Right? So the fact that a few Antifa people would, punch a Nazi or break a few windows is over-escalated as violence per se, whereas the state apparatus and everything that it does, which Martin Luther King, of course, famously pointed out, that the US is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and of course the statement is of d'actualité, as you'd say, it's a very contemporary statement, means that this aesthetics of violence, it inverts things. It's like a dialectic of sorts, right? The most violent forms imaginable are rendered invisible, and the most infinitesimal forms of quote-unquote violence are given full-fledged force as if they were just violence incarnate. This overlaps with the issue of direct action, because I think a lot of the grains of sand that you see, they're direct actions. And when you perceive direct action as a form of violence, it's precisely because you are disturbed by the grains of sand and you don't see the system, meaning the whole well-oiled machinery and the cogs that those grains of sand are falling into. And it's that machinery that is much more violent. In other words, we should think about indirect action. People are angry that there's some direct action against, these figures that David was referring to, but what about the indirect action of an entire military-industrial academic complex that is favoring particular worldviews, practices, doing research and analysis for the military, etc.? That is rendered largely invisible, right? Fourth point to this is the status of the university and the liberal discourse on the university being an ivory tower. If you know anything about the history of universities, their roots are in the most sordid and dark aspects of the history of imperialism, right? Universities taught scientific racism for years and years and years, and arguably in certain cases still do, or at least justify certain approaches to them, like in the work of Charles Murray, who's regularly invited, or was at least, to various universities. And that presuppose a kind of separation of spheres that I think we have to be radically critical of. And the last thing that I'll say is the role of nationalism in obfuscating the extent to which there are multiple modes of governance that are often operative within a single nation state. So people would say, oh no, as an American I have rights, or as a French person I live in the French Republic, when in fact that's true for certain sectors of the population, but by no means for all sectors of the population. And look at foreign policy if you want to know what your government's actually doing and try to understand it instead of just, siphoning off or being weaned on the stockpile of amnesia. If you look at the history of the way in which the state performs its political theater and here I'm thinking of the so-called liberal democracies of the Western world, and their various propped up imperial governments around the world as well, is that it's as if the state has the best interests of the citizenry in mind, and that therefore it's going to be the police that are somehow going to protect us against things like fascism and whatnot. But when you actually look at the material record, of course, there's an enormous complicity between these two. And at times then, and there's a famous case that occurred in France, in Montpellier, not that long ago, where it's they're often the same people, right? Cop by day, fascist by night, or on the weekend, or whatnot. In the case of Montpellier, there was a student occupation, and during the occupation, the dean decided to open a back door and let in a bunch of hooded fascist black shirts with a taser and a pallet, sticks of wood, to beat the students into submission until they left. And they successfully did that and then celebrated. And then the police orchestrated the exit for the fascist black shirts so that they couldn't be filmed by the students or held accountable in any way. And that type of relationship is, of course, I might just be saying the obvious at this point in time, but it should be very clear about how those forms of violence segue into one another. And the question of then whether or not we go to the police for certain things is, I think, a really important question, because we should know who we'd be going to, right? About the issue of different kind of forms of violence, I tend to be just a bit reticent insofar as picking up on Pierre's comment earlier. If we want to understand violence as relational, I don't know if it's very helpful to then identify different, give a kind of typology of violence. It might be useful pragmatically in certain instances, so I'm not going to, make any grandiose universal claims, but I think that often how violence operates is it's about a force field of struggle, and in that force field there are different agencies that are operative. And so I wouldn't simply want to label them as one way or another and demarcate them, at least in general, in those terms. One is coming back to the issue of violence. I think that it operates in a propagandistic way because it allows people to only talk about the means and ignore the ends. So you don't hear about, Antifa bombed the McDonald's because they're against global capitalism and against its fascist forms, right? You just hear about the bombing of the McDonald's. And this then relates to your second and I think central point, and that is, as organizers or people involved in politics in various ways, we have to be attentive to the extent to which violence is one of these operators, but there are many other operators that function in such a way that politics and the mass media operate largely in harmony with one another in order to spin particular narratives. And violent street confrontations are not only sometimes red herrings in order to distract from other things, but they're also quite clearly orchestrated and manipulated in various ways. Because the best way to delegitimate a movement is you pin them in certain ways that there are various reactions, and then you have the violence that the mass media can blame on the protesters. And I've seen, Paris is or the French riot police are specialists in this, because what they do in cordoning off the streets is that they make sure they control all access and exit and entrance points. Mm-hmm. Then they begin to strangle the entire movement so people can't get in or out, and what they're looking for is confrontation. And they're verbally aggressive, they do everything in their power, and they have an entire playbook on this in order to spark the violent response, and thereby use the street confrontation as a justification for then propagandistically laying blame on the entire march failed because a few windows of McDonald's were broken.
You should mention the whole reconstruction of Paris under Haussmann.
Yeah, was part of it. For sure. Yeah, because that was destroying the conditions of possibility for barricades, right? And easy military deployment from one part of the city to the next. And so the entire urban environment is, of course, set up in order to control these things. I really like the insistence on organizational questions, because it is one thing. It's like going to a protest or going to, punch a Nazi or sign a petition or whatever this is. The temporality of it is so intermittent that it is largely disconnected from a long-term mode of organization in which you are doing multiple things usually. You're strategizing, you're understanding how counter-revolutionary techniques work, you're mobilizing for things that will take place over time, and you're also trying to own the media narrative,
Yeah.
which is an extremely important part of organizing, meaning that you control your own media feeds, you have people who are doing media and outreach in various ways, because all of that is actually part of the political package. And so I couldn't agree more with this kind of, it's a more robust understanding of what organizing is. It's not intermittent, it's an entire life of collective planning in order to develop more power and strength over time. To add to that, I think it's a very important point that there are, and you see it, I mean, there are many very, very good examples of it, particularly within the kind of the history of nation states formerly colonized by Euro-America. Those cycles, though, for instance, from a quote-unquote liberal democracy, for instance, to a dictatorship, often then have to do with the larger global political and economic dynamic, right? The history of dictatorships in Latin America is the history of US intervention in Latin America, right. The same thing. And so those cycles, I wouldn't want to naturalize them, for one, and I would also then want to situate them in this broader power field, but also recognize that under liberal modes of governance, in particular nation states, there's always populations, usually the lumpen proletariat or the migrant populations and whatnot, whose mode of governance is fascism, if it's under a liberal democracy or not. And there are great examples of people who say, well, you know, life under a dictatorship or life under a liberal democracy didn't really make any difference to my life because my life was always governed by fascistic modes. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the socioeconomic class and its relationship to the centers of power. Good organizers need to have a good offense and a good defense, meaning that there are a lot of people who have street tactics and they know how to organize things when they go on the offensive, but knowledge about how securitarian forces operate and how they infiltrate, how they run smear campaigns in the media and all of that is enormously powerful insofar as then you can, like you say, you read their security books and then you have the playbook by which you know either how you can avoid being ensnared within their apparatus or you can use their apparatus against itself. And I think that's very important. The only other thing that I would say is that I do think that securitarianism, which is not security, right? Securitarianism is it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts, and I think that a lot of the contemporary discourse and practice operates in this way, because ultimately under a regime of securitarianism, you can never be secure. Right? The whole discourse is that there is a threat that's out there, and so you have to beef up the security apparatus to such an extent that the security apparatus will, through a self-fulfilling prophecy, ensure that someone will be found who is performing some type of criminal act, and usually due to the securitarian nature of things, it will be provoked, right? The number of quote-unquote terrorist attacks in the United States that were due to FBI informants basically taking activists by the hand, putting bombs made by the FBI in their hands, and then taking them to the site, and usually the activist saying, no, I'm not so sure about this, I'm a little nervous about this. The statistics on this are phenomenal. It's the mass majority, for sure. And so I think that we also have to come to terms, and that's some of the kind of intellectual work that needs to go into organizing. How can we understand securitarianism and how it operates in all of its various forms? So I think it's a really important point.
Fascism, when it arrived on the European scene, particularly in Italy and then extended to Germany, was later framed in terms of the kind of dominant history that we get in textbooks in the mass media as being an anomaly, an exception, a kind of break with democratic rule. And of course, there were certain things that were relatively unprecedented. But one of the extraordinary things when you look at the actual history of fascist movements is that there were fascist movements in every capitalist state in the wake of the Great Depression, and that fascism always took on specific forms in relationship to its inscription within a very unique national context. In fact, one extraordinary analysis in this regard comes straight from the mouth of a fascist, a self-declared fascist, General Francisco Franco in Spain, who said, quote, "Fascism, since that is the word that is used, fascism presents, wherever it manifests itself, characteristics which are varied to the extent that countries and national temperaments vary," end quote. Which of course makes sense, because if ultranationalism is one of the key components of fascism, then when it manifests itself in different countries, simply taking models from elsewhere and imposing them would create the sense that, well, this is a foreign development and other such things. Georgy Dmitriev pointed out that when fascism is operative in the United States, it will be under the name of American patriotism and the defense of the Constitution. Right? And so specifically within the US context, there were, of course, a whole series of fascist and semi-fascist organizations that were operative in the 30s and even prior to the 1930s. So much so that there was a lot of discussion, even in the mainstream press, of Mussolini's black shirt simply being the Italian version of the Ku Klux Klan. And this makes a lot of sense from the perspective, from a historical perspective, because of the dedication on the part of organizations like the Silver Legion, Ku Klux Klan, Friends of Germany, and other such fascist or semi-fascist organizations, because they were organizations that were dedicated to many of the same things that the black shirts in Italy and the Nazis were dedicated to. The supremacy of so-called Western civilization, a pro-capitalist orientation, a rabid anti-communism, an investment in ultranationalism that bleeds into imperialism and colonialism. And so in my own research, it's been very important to break with this ideology of fascist exceptionalism that suggests it only occurred maybe once or twice in history in unique places, and instead extend the analysis to look at all of these different fascist movements, both in the past and, as you opened, as well in the present.
Well, what's interesting about these kind of paramilitary vigilante groups is that they were green-lighted by the ruling elites, especially after the Civil War, to carry out a reign of terror. And there were the White Leagues, there were all sorts of organizations against African Americans. They were used, the gun thugs, the militias, the Pinkertons, the American Legion were used to attack militant workers, the Wobblies, with great deals of violence. Hundreds of people were killed. So there's always been built within the American system an accepted wing of fascism, and that nurturing of that wing in a time of crisis is very dangerous, as we saw in the 1930s and as we are seeing now. Perhaps you can talk about what happens in societal breakdown. You write extensively about the attempt by the business elites to carry out a coup, recruiting the former Marine Corps General Smedley Butler. But draw those parallels between the 1930s and now, and what happens to these this nucleus. And we have to also acknowledge that these kind of paramilitary organizations have expanded with the creation of mercenary forces run by, many of them by Betsy DeVos's brother, the former Blackwater, I think it's called Z now or something. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that you're alluding to that's so important for understanding both the deep history of fascism and its contemporary manifestations in the 21st century is the political economy of fascism, right? And so sometimes it's assumed that fascism is simply a set of ideas or beliefs, and that in order to struggle against them, we need to wage a kind of ideological war in the name of being more tolerant, fighting against a politics of hate and other such things. And in my own research, one of the things that I've kind of tried to bring to the fore, and other researchers have done this as well, is the ways in which so many of these movements gain both prominence and media visibility through the support of certain factions of the capitalist ruling class. And so in the case of the 1930s, in the article that you're alluding to that I published on the planned seizure of state power within the United States to establish an explicit fascist dictatorship. This was the language that was used at the time, right? They weren't using the kind of whitewashed language in the post-white World War II era in which people would suggest, oh, it's not really fascist, maybe it's something else. They were explicit about this being a fascist dictatorship. And the capitalist ruling class contributed, and this included some of the leading families among the kind of robber barons of the early 20th century. Morgan of JP Morgan, the bank, DuPont, Rockefeller, Pew, Mellon, all of these elements of the capitalist ruling class recognized that they had an extreme and profound crisis on their hands. That crisis was both economic and ideological. The economic crisis was due to the fact that the Great Depression had really just wreaked havoc over the capitalist countries, and it had not done this to the Soviet, to the Soviet Union, which had broken with capitalism, at least to a very large extent, as a socialist state. And so it was becoming increasingly clear to many people, particularly the working and toiling masses, that capitalism wasn't working and that socialism was doing a lot better. This was linked to an ideological crisis, and that was the inability of the political elite in the capitalist classes to rule hegemonically, meaning to rule by consent, to get the general population on board with their particular project. The election of FDR was quite important for the consolidation of a particular orientation within the political elite at that point in time, which basically amounted to a slight class compromise with the New Deal as it was established in the 30s. The idea being that FDR was going to shore up the interests of the capitalist ruling class and give small provisions to certain sectors of the working class in order to stave off revolution, right? But another faction of the capitalist ruling class, as well as the right wing of the Democratic Party, broke with FDR over this because they were looking at and examining what was going on in Europe, and they identified fascism as the best possible solution for both the economic and the ideological crisis of capitalism, right? Because fascism would allow them to get a certain sector of the population on board with a rabidly capitalist, anti-communist, anti-worker program that would ultimately allow them to increase their profits and invest in the permanent war economy. The following, and I should preface this by saying sometimes when people identify conspiracies on the part of the capitalist ruling class or the political elite, people will cry foul immediately and say, this is a conspiracy theory, this has never been proven. Just so that your listeners know, and viewers, this was proven by the US government and the McCormick-Dickstein committee that investigated it, that there was indeed a conspiracy to overthrow the US government and establish a fascist dictatorship. Even though this same committee also, they cut out some of the testimony in their final published report. And so it took a lot of investigative journalism to get the full story. But what we now know, and in fact we knew as of about 1934, 1935, is that a significant faction of the capitalist ruling class, and finance capital in particular, created in 1934 the American Liberty League. And this Liberty League brought together business elites and high-profile political figures, many of whom were on the right wing of the Democratic Party, as I mentioned a moment ago. And they both put together the funds necessary, $3 million, but they said they had up to $300 million, so an extraordinary amount of money, to hire what they referred to as a man on the white horse. They wanted a kind of military-style leader who they could use as the figurehead for this particular movement. They hired Gerald G. McGuire, who was an employee of a brokerage firm, to go and do a study tour for 4 months of European fascist movements in order to identify the best movement or the best model to be applied in the United States. He came back after going to Germany, Spain, Italy, and France, and did identify some of what he considered to be the strengths of those various movements, like Hitler's solution to unemployment was forced labor. He thought that would be a great idea within the context of the United States. Or the black shirts who used as the backbone for their movement impoverished veterans. He also thought that was a great idea. But the primary model that he latched onto was a fascist organization in France called the Croix de Feu, or the Cross of Fire. And that was a fascist organization composed of some 500,000 commissioned and non-commissioned officers that later would grow into actually the biggest political party in France in the Third Republic. So it's a very significant fascist organization. And with this model in mind, then he reached out to General Smedley Butler, who was identified as one potential candidate. There were others, including General Douglas MacArthur, James E. Van Sant, and others, and put to him the following project, that if he could raise an army of about 500,000 veterans, march on Washington, and force FDR to accept him as a kind of Secretary of General Affairs, and then take a position as just a figurehead, very much like the King of Italy, then the government could be the elected government could be displaced, he would become the de facto leader and could then pursue the agenda of his capitalist backers, which was to roll back the New Deal and to allow them to accumulate at the level that they'd like to accumulate. And moreover, by then also throwing the veterans themselves who had been mobilized in this fascist army under the bus, so to speak, because they were going to be paid their pensions for just 1 year, but after the fascist seizure of power was consolidated, they were going to be let go. That is the plot in a nutshell, but there were also other parallel plots I should mention just in passing. This was not the only one.
Well, and this is exactly what the Nazis did. They betrayed the working class. They gave them May Day off, and then they abolished all the unions. The very core of their support, in many ways, came from certainly the rural working class, not so much the industrial working class. And you saw the same thing in Italy. I want to draw a parallel, which you do in the article. So you talk about how during the investigations by the McCormick and Dickstein Committee in the House of Representatives, there was an immediate attempt to kind of cover up what the committee discovered to protect the ruling business elites. And you draw a parallel between what happened then and what's happening now.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, we can see very clearly because we have the distance that historically allows us to see more, in a much more straightforward manner what was going on then. It ran a faith in government campaign. And this is often what bourgeois democracies will do when it becomes part of the public record that there's been some malfeasance on the part of the political elite or the capitalist ruling class. There's so much blowback that they have to do something. And so a faith in government campaign consists in recognizing certain facts, but then doing everything that they can in order to consolidate the general population's belief that the government is ruling in their own best interest, right? So in the case of this committee that was investigating the fascist plot, they recognized that there was a fascist plot, but they refused to call for testifying any of the capitalist backers because this was simply based on quote unquote hearsay, right? Which is actually testimony on the part of those who were being enrolled in the plot. They also censored their report, as I mentioned earlier. They tried to use Red Scare tactics by saying that, well, the communists were backing some strike movements and whatnot, and they didn't pursue any prosecutions of the conspirators, even though it was a proven conspiracy, right? And as we know from the contemporary moment, the Republicans have been pushing back on a concrete investigation into what exactly happened on January 6th. We could, of course, relate this to other moments, right? The Warren Commission in the wake of the JFK assassination. We could look at the 9/11 Commission. There are so many other examples of what the political elite in a bourgeois democracy like the United States will do to try to really minimize the blowback from proven conspiracies or from moments in time like January 6th, where a lot more needs to be known about who exactly was involved in allowing this to happen or participating in it financially from behind the scenes, right? In that regard, we don't only need governmental investigations because of the limitations that I've just pointed out, but we need the work of investigative journalists, of activists and militants who are really putting the pressure on in order to figure out what's actually going on behind the kind of political spectacle that's often created.
Well, in a footnote here, you're quoting Vanessa Wills. She talks about the DeVos families, the Koch brothers, Robert Mercer, the Dorr brothers, as key figures in the Capitol attack, drawn primarily from the ranks of small business owners, military, etc. They were astroturfing or funding, as they did with the Tea Party, very similar kind of phenomena.
Absolutely, 100%. And this is again why the political economy of fascism is so important. When there are fascist movements on the ground, these are rarely simply absolutely organic and grassroots unto themselves, because of the way in which they also play into the hands and interests of the capitalist ruling class. They're pro-capitalist, anti-socialist, generally anti-worker, etc. And so the capitalist backers of the lockdown protests, as they're called, are a really important part of the lead up to what happened on January 6th. And also the question of the complicity of the state in both allowing and potentially even encouraging what happened on January 6th. I'll just point your listeners to a very important statement made by Mike German, who's a former FBI agent and now a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. He pointed out that some of those involved in the Capitol riot had been involved in similar incidents in recent years and were repeatedly caught on tape. And this is a quote from Mike German. "We know their names. We know their criminal histories. They've been doing it because the police have been letting them do it. They've been doing it because the FBI have been letting them do it," end quote, right? And this is from a former FBI agent. And so this should raise questions both about the capitalist backers and the state complicity in fascist forces on the ground. And one of the reasons it's important to see this kind of triangulation between the capitalist backers, the state, and then parastate or parallel fascist organizations is because historically we know that this is often how fascist organizations have worked.
And they successfully mute the press or turn the press into a megaphone. You have examples of that, how when Smedley Butler exposed this plot, he was discredited on the front pages of the New York Times and everywhere else. But just in the last minute and a half, I want you to talk about where we are now, how dangerous a moment it is, and to what extent have these historical antecedents informed us about where we're going.
Yeah, one of the important things is to see that as Biden came into office in the United States, he used the PR campaign of being the savior of democracy and the kind of last bulwark against Trumpism as a halo that really permitted him to roll back so many of his campaign promises and to continue the U.S. imperialist expansions abroad, as well as crackdowns internally on dissent. And in that regard, we should not simply be hoodwinked by this kind of good cop, bad cop logic that's often operative in bourgeois democracies, where you have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party kind of functioning in this capacity, and instead recognize that there has not been a serious reckoning with what happened on January 6th, and that even the Democratic Party has a vested interest in continuing to function as a kind of tolerant party for fascist elements, because those fascist elements, as we know from history, are the final solution to class struggle. So if capitalism is on its heels, if socialism is advancing, the capitalist ruling class is not going to allow itself to be overthrown peacefully, right? It will mobilize counter-revolutionary forces of the most draconian sort. And so the fact that under Democratic leadership with Biden, you have the continuation of fascist organizations in the United States, US imperialism, we have these fascist elements that are really integral to the deep history of capitalism. And therefore, from our perspective, as those who are struggling for a more egalitarian world, we have to recognize that fascism takes different forms and different shapes, and that it's always an element operative under capitalist rule. And bourgeois democracy, as much as it can help us stave off certain fascist elements, will keep some of them in the wings in case there's ever a real threat to bourgeois democratic and hence capitalist rule.
Define fascism, male fantasies defines it as, in essence, an emotional state. But before we talk about its undercurrents, which have always existed in American society, let's talk about what it is.
So fascism is often defined in terms of what we could call its kind of superstructural aspects, meaning the ways in which it mobilizes a particular ideology that is driven by militarism, ultranationalism that's rooted in ethnic base, white supremacy is often a part of it. But I think it's important to recognize that those superstructural components are ultimately rooted in deep material relations of capitalist accumulation. And so if we speak specifically about interwar fascism in Europe and how it rose to power, it's integral to recognize that this was at a moment in time at which the capitalist world system was coming into crisis. Of course, that full crisis would occur with the Great Depression. And this was also at a moment in time on the heels of the first successful workers' revolution in the Soviet Union. And so some of the central driving forces beneath the superstructural or ideological aspects of fascism that we need to discuss and bring to the fore are the is the desire to do two things. One is to impose, maintain, and intensify capitalist social relations. And the other is to beat back the threat of workers' organizations, and more specifically, communism and socialism.
And there's an uneasy alliance often between the business elites and the self-identified fascists in the case of the Nazis, or, I would argue the kind of Christian fascists in the United States. It's not like the state capitalism that is imposed or was imposed by the Soviet Union. It has a different relationship with capital, sometimes an uneasy relationship with capital. Can you speak about that alliance?
Well, the global ruling class, if we talk just specifically about the emergence of European fascism and what some people refer to as the classical model of fascism, so in Italy and Germany, the global capitalist class, and more specifically the US capitalist class for General Motors, Rockefeller, etc., bankrolled the rise, particularly in Nazi Germany. And the reason for that was at least twofold. One was that Germany, in the wake of World War I, was seen as a viable site of investment for rearmament, and particularly for big industry. So big capital invested massively in Germany. In fact, it was one of the central sites of American foreign investment in Europe at that point in time. At the same time, there was an interest on the part of the capitalist ruling class to crush workers' organizations and to make sure that there weren't picket lines, strikes, an organized workforce that was causing them problems in the negotiations between big capital and labor. In that regard, the Nazi rise to power, as well as the Italian rise of fascism, that started prior to the Nazis, was funded by big capital. And there's excellent work, both big capital in Europe and in the United States. And as they came into power and they worked through liberal parliamentary democracy, of bourgeois democracy, and this is a very important part of this history, is that liberalism and parliamentarianism was not a bulwark against the rise of fascism. On the contrary, it provided for a framework within which the fascists could rise to power, bankrolled by big capital, right? So we have bourgeois democracy, much like what we have in this country, where big money wins out. Once in power, though, you're absolutely right that in the case of Italy, it was a little slower. In the case of Germany, it was quicker, but there was a shift from a fascist mobilization of certain sectors of civil society, in particular the petty bourgeoisie, to a more authoritarian, state-driven form of consolidated top-down power. And what the investor class of big capital was interested in having happen, particularly in the case of Nazi Germany, because its power far exceeded that of Italy, was to destroy the real threat, which was the Soviet Union, and to partake in a colonial rampage to the east that was mirrored on, quite explicitly, the colonial rampage of the United States to the west and the western frontier. And one of the complications, and I take it that this is what you're alluding to, is that it was very hard once Hitler in particular, but Mussolini as well, had really consolidated their power in the state apparatus, for big capital to make all of the decisions regarding the particular policies that were being implemented. And so one way of understanding what happened was that big capital backed this project for very explicit reasons, and then it kind of ran amok and got a little bit out of control. And so one of the big questions was, well, how could they save their investments and nonetheless shut down, or allow, I should say, the Nazi war machine in particular to be shut down? Because ultimately it was the Red Army that was at the core of the defeat of Nazism, not the U.S. intervention, which was very small in comparison to what the Soviets were doing. And it's at that point in time, when it was clear that the Soviets were marching westward, that there was an endeavor on the part of the U.S., in particular the U.S. national security state, the OSS that became the CIA, to protect assets and to make sure that the business investments of big capital, particularly American big capital, but more generally international big capital, was protected. And so, of course, there were no corporate prosecutions in the wake of World War II, and a lot of the assets and the investments were protected by the national security state, as well as a lot of the Nazis that they worked very closely with.
Before I ask you about, how the protean nature of fascism and how, as you argue in your writings, it did not disappear with the end of World War II, in fact, was enveloped by the United States, or certainly large sectors of the ruling elites, the military-industrial complex. Let's talk about fascism within the United States. Robert Paxton, in his book Anatomy of Fascism, argues, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan was America's most authentically fascist movement, and that movements that can be described as fascist predate World War II and up to the present. Can you talk about that undercurrent of movements that we would describe as fascist within America? And then we'll talk about what happened after World War II.
Yes, that's absolutely essential, because fascism emerged first and foremost as a set of movements. And it was only later that it was conceptualized and eventually made into a doctrine, even in the case of Italy, where, of course, the term first appeared. But if we look at the movements themselves and don't get hung up on when it was labeled and how it was labeled, it's obvious that the structural similarities between what was going on in Europe in the interwar period and what was going on in the United States, not only in the interwar period, but of course before that, not only resembles fascism, but many recognized as fascism once the term itself was minted, so to speak. And so in the case of the United States, it's important to recognize that when the US entered World War I, the idea was, according to Woodrow Wilson, that we would fight a war to make the world safe for democracy. But he specified that what that meant was to, quote, keep the white race strong and to preserve, quote, white civilization and its domination of the planet, end quote. So within this context, of course, you have the US white supremacy that dates back to the deep history of the settler colony, but that really also took off in the interwar period and was recognized directly by the Nazis as the best model for racial apartheid and racial statecraft. And they studied the American examples for precisely this reason. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that there was one model of a state that had developed the aspects of racist statecraft that needed to be taken to their next level in the Nazi Third Reich, and that was the United States. And so in the case of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, we have 5 million vigilantes who orchestrated parastate violence that was racist, white supremacist, pro-Christian, pro-capitalist, and it was allowed to act with impunity. Right? And so it's a very good example of precisely the structural mechanisms that were operative within the case of interwar fascism, or the rise of fascism within the European case. And in fact, so much so that when Italian fascism first came on the international scene, there were many articles in the US press that recognized that what fascism in Europe was the European model of the Ku Klux Klan. Moreover, it's not just the Klan, right? There were a whole series of other vigilante organizations, fascist organizations, explicitly Nazi organizations, as well as corporate-backed vigilante forms of violence that were put in place in order to protect the rule of big capital. And so I'll just highlight 2 examples in that regard. One is the role of the American Legion. The American Legion, we shouldn't forget, one of the commanders is on record as saying that the fascisti are to Italy what the American Legion is to the United States. And the American Legion was, of course, involved in the 1934 attempt to orchestrate a fascist coup within the United States, right? There's this example is extremely important, but it's also significant that just as in the case cases in Italy and Germany, fascism operates largely through parastate violence, or violence that is outsourced to civil society in various ways, but it also mobilizes the state. And so in the interwar period, we should not forget about the Palmer raids and the ways in which in 1919 and 1920, the General Intelligence Division of the US Justice Department orchestrated raids in more than 30 US cities, arresting between 5,000 and 10,000 anti-capitalist activists. So you had an enormous crackdown both on the part of the state, these parastate forms of vigilante violence, that was not only parallel to what was going on in Europe, but was largely recognized as feeding into and a model for a lot of what developed there.
Great. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation about the nature of fascism in our corporate state with Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about fascism in our corporate state with Professor Gabriel Rockhill. So let's talk about what happened after the war. And it wasn't just Werner von Braun and the 200 Nazi scientists who came over to work for the defense industry and on the space program, but there was a huge incorporation of some of the worst war criminals in the Nazi intelligence apparatus who were fused into the American intelligence apparatus. So on the one hand, you had public denunciations of fascism, but internally within the structures of power, there was an embrace not only of fervent fascists, but I think you would argue the ideology of fascism itself.
Absolutely. One of the things that's important to recognize is that a lot of the history that we've been given regarding World War II and its consequences is an ideological history that also focuses on visible government, or what was going on above board, meaning in the political theater that the capitalist state presents through the corporate media that it controls. But the invisible government, meaning the US national security state, which is really formed in its, basic architecture in World War II with the OSS and then would become the CIA, that this invisible government worked very closely to ensure that the Nazis and fascists, who had been recognized prior to World War II as great allies because they were anti-communists and they were very good at organizing militarily to crush workers' movements, and this is not only communism, but various forms of socialism, anarchism, any progressive movement, really, that's driven by popular power. And so already during World War II, one of the important parts of this history is that Alan Dulles, who was in Switzerland at the time with the OSS and would later become the head of the CIA, was working to try to broker a peace agreement with the Nazis so that the Nazis would sign an agreement with the West and with the United States, and they could unleash the full force of the Nazi war machine against the Soviets. He wasn't able to successfully broker that, but as the war began to draw to a close, he then, with others who would become major architects in the national security state, like James Angleton, who was working in Italy, undertook Operation Sunrise. And Operation Sunrise was an endeavor to repurpose the Nazis and fascists for doing what they're best at and what they were doing prior to World War II, and the reason they were supported prior to World War II, and that was fighting communists. And so there's a number of examples of this. You've already alluded to the scientists that were brought into the United States through Operation Paperclip. It is important to note that there were 1,600 scientists who were referred to as Hitler's angels of death that were brought in. They were given laboratories, they were given housing, their families could come, they were promised citizenship if their work bore fruit. And by bearing fruit, that meant developing, as they did, chemical weapons, biological weapons that could then be used by the US empire in its post-war global hegemony. But this is, of course, only part of the story. There are also the intelligence services within Germany and Italy that were then repurposed. The case of Germany is quite flagrant because Reinhard Gehlen was the head of German intelligence under the Nazi Third Reich that was directed against the Soviet Union. And in the post-war period, the CIC, which worked for the army, was an intelligence branch of the army, and then eventually the CIA, so the US national security state, undertook an examination of Galen and his organization and decided that the best thing to do with him, instead of incarcerating him, bringing him up on charges at Nuremberg or other such things, was to repurpose him as the head of the intelligence service in Germany. And he worked very closely with the US national security state. And it's estimated that his organization, the Galen organization, rounded up some 4,000 Nazi agents to work within Germany. And this became actually the core of the contemporary German intelligence service. The same thing went on in Italy, and there were also, for any of the Nazis and fascists that the US National Security State wanted to work with that they couldn't maintain in Europe, they established rat lines. Rat lines are basically forms of exfiltration, how to get Nazis and fascists from Europe to other parts of the world where they could be used productively in the CIA's international war against socialism and communism. And so there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, that were allowed to go to Latin America. There were in fact 10,000 Nazis that were allowed to immigrate into the United States in the post-war period. And so all of this history, I think, is important for understanding that. Oh, and there's actually one other aspect that I'd like to touch on, and that is the network of stay-behind armies in Europe. The stay-behind armies were set up in all NATO countries in the wake of World War II by the US national security state. And the idea was that that the US should hire fascists, Nazis, and collaborators in sub rosa organizations, so clandestine organizations that were militant terrorist organizations that would be able to, if the Russians moved westward, function as a stay-behind army, so behind enemy lines, and then undertake acts of terror, exfiltration, sabotage, and other such things. And these armies were actually mobilized very explicitly in the 1960s and following in what's referred to as the strategy of tension, in which there were a series of terror attacks across, Italy, Germany, and Belgium that were blamed on the hard left and in particular on the communists, but were actually overseen by the stay-behind armies that were funded by the CIA and overseen by the CIA and the MI6, which is, of course, the British version of the CIA, with NATO backing and intelligence backing. So when you put all of these pieces together, and there are a few others as well, what you see is not a defeat of fascism in the post-war era, but rather a internationalization of European fascism under the liberal cover of the United States pseudo-democracy, and that internationalization really set up the architecture for global politics in the post-war era.
I used to live in Cochabamba, Bolivia. I studied Spanish there when Klaus Barbie, I saw him on the Prado with his bodyguards, the butcher of Lyon, the man who killed Jean Moulin. And certainly during the Garcia Mesa coup in Bolivia, he was running the intelligence operation. So that was just a small example. He was eventually extradited to France when the Bolivian government became a democracy. I want to ask about where we are now. So you have these undercurrents which you've just described, not only ideologically, but also structurally, which remain in place. Now we are facing the kind of social inequality that we saw in the 1930s, the severance of large sectors of the population into what we call Trumpism, but certainly a non-reality-based universe filled with rage and focusing on scapegoats. I think it should always be said that racism, anti-Semitism, these are irrational. I find historians who go back and ask questions about why Hitler was anti-Semitic. Was it because his mother was treated by a Jewish doctor and died? Ridiculous, because this is not a rational belief system. And if you come at it purely from a Cartesian point of view, you won't understand it. We're seeing a very similar period, and I always remember Fritz Stern, the great historian, telling me, who spent a refugee from Nazi Germany, left when he was 18, taught at Columbia University. But he said that in Weimar, Germany, there was a yearning for fascism before the word fascism was invented. And I think we're seeing that yearning today. I want you to talk about the fact that fascist ideology and structures that have embraced fascism remain within the country, and what that means for the current crisis, certainly within the United States, but we're seeing it in Hungary and other places as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and so important for the contemporary moment. I would say two things. The first is that it is very important to resist what I refer to as the one state, one government paradigm, meaning the idea that if the corporate media tells us that we're living in a liberal democracy, then that is the last word, and that liberal democracy oversees the entirety of the population, meaning that we all have rights, there's a state that's going to protect them, and other such things. Against this, I put forth a kind of multiple modes of governance model. And what this is it recognizes that there are different sectors of the population that are governed differently based on the particular needs of capitalist social relations. And so if fascists aren't directly in power and don't have state power consolidated, this does not mean in the least that there aren't fascist movements. On the contrary. And so the analysis of fascism has to be expanded just beyond the state apparatus and recognize that even in the interwar period that we were just talking about, there were fascist movements in all capitalist states in the wake of the Great Depression. And so secondly, just highlighting and coming back to some of the things that you pointed out, there are a lot of remarkable structural similarities between the interwar period 100 years ago and what we're living through now. We have a severe economic crisis that rivals, if not surpasses, the Great Depression. We have an enormous political crisis in which the legitimacy of so-called representative democracies after 40, 50 years of neoliberalism is withering away, and people see through it very clearly. If they don't see through it ideologically, they see through it materially, meaning that they recognize they don't have access to affordable healthcare, affordable education, affordable housing, and everything else that was at least part of the welfare state, which is not to make the welfare state into an ideal, but is to recognize that one of the things that neoliberal capitalism has done is slowly but surely withered away the social protections that were guaranteed under the welfare state. And what this means is that the general population is facing a situation in which there's a crisis in global capitalism, a severe one, that's combined with a crisis of political legitimacy. And we can add to that, of course, a social crisis of extreme sorts, that, as we've seen with the racist police violence that is going on unabated within the United States. We have a global health crisis on our hands. All of that is calling into question the political viability of the pseudo-democracies that have tried to establish some form of hegemonic rule within the capitalist world. And what I mean by hegemonic rule is rule by consensus, right? If the material basis for affordable healthcare, affordable education, other such things, survival wages and things like this are maintained, then some people will have the material basis by which to give their consent to the government. But given the withering away of that material basis, there is more and more a crisis of these modes of governance. And in response to that, there are different reactions. And what we see, I couldn't agree more, is a radical polarization. And so globally, there's been a very clear rise in authoritarian, fascist modes of governance. There are a million examples that I'm sure all of your listeners and viewers are familiar with. And a lot of that is a response on the part of international capital to the crisis of capitalism and the need to shore it up. And one way of shoring it up is through militarized accumulation, through investing in forms of repressive violence that are simultaneously forms of capitalist accumulation. They're very profitable, and they serve to quell the social unrest that is inevitable when people don't have the material basis by which to survive. At the same time, on the hopeful front, there is a very resurgent, I would say, youth-driven, proletarian-driven, working-class movements in the United States. It's very clear, as we've seen across the summer and into the fall, that there is a sense that if it be the Democratic Party or even the Sanders campaign, there's a lot of political organizing in movements, parties, organizations, etc., that are to the left of the consolidated consensus of these neoliberal parties, if they be Democratic or Republican. And so in that regard, the battle of the 21st century is very much emerging as emergent or re-emergent forms of fascism confronted with social movements from below that are gaining power. At the same time, maybe the last thing that I would say is that when fascism rose to power in the interwar period, it was also largely in response to the Soviet Union and to the communist states. And in the current global situation, the dynamic is obviously very, very different. So one thing that's important for progressives to recognize is that we have to build power quickly. We have to consolidate organizations. We have to work through party mechanisms, because that's the only real way of defeating fascism.
War, the colonial war, was precisely what Hitler undertook against the savage barbarians of the East, right? And in particular, those in the Soviet Union, who are identified as part of this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy against the very principles of Western civilization. And so that history is very important to know, and it's one of the reasons that I think that the category of fascism, it's helpful to relate the category of fascism to kind of two different levels of analysis. And at one level, one very general sense, there's a fascist element to the history of capitalist colonial expansion. What I mean by that is that the capitalist ruling class used the state and vigilantes, militias, etc., in order to impose by force on the populations of the world exploitative and oppressive relationships of the capitalist system. And so the great Aimé Césaire pointed this out, right? We used to build concentration camps in the colonies. Everyone was fine with that. They start getting bent out of shape when it starts happening in Europe with the Nazis, right? But that being said, it is also important, if you're going to do conjunctural analysis, to highlight some of the specificities of what happened in the early 20th century. And so one of the lead-ups to what happened then was the financial crisis of the capitalist system, and the fact that many people around the world were recognizing that capitalism wasn't working for the masses of humanity. And this was coupled with the fact that in 1917, there was the first successful, workers' revolution that established a workers' state. And so capitalism had a very clear alternative. And so one way of understanding the specificity of fascism as it conjuncturally emerges in Europe in the early 20th century is, at least in part, a reaction formation to the ideological and economic crisis of the capitalist world, coupled with the threat of an alternative system, meaning a socialist system. And so capitalism had to go on the warpath. And that's why the capitalist ruling class funded the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and wanted him, as he did, particularly in the case of Hitler, to unleash the war of wars on the Soviet Union, on the greatest threat to the capitalist system at that point in time.
Gabriel, let me just stay with you for a second about what actually happened in the 1930s. The U.S. obviously went to war against Nazi Germany, and at the end of the war proclaimed that the victory against fascism was a triumph of bourgeois democracy. They didn't call it bourgeois democracy, of course, a triumph of democracy in America. But I know I've read your writings, and I know that you and Claudia have discussed this and taught about this. The U.S. ruling class was pretty pro-German when Hitler took over. And Hitler didn't seize power in 1933. There wasn't a Nazi revolution or a Nazi even counter-revolution. He was appointed. He was appointed by right-center political forces within the German capitalist establishment who had myriad ties with the Bush family, the Kennedy family, Henry Ford. And a lot of the U.S. bourgeoisie looked to Germany as a way to regiment and discipline or to destroy the growing labor movement of the 1930s. There wasn't like a profound anti-fascism within the American bourgeoisie. And of course, in Madison Square Garden in 1939, this was in New York, not Montgomery, Alabama, New York City. The garden was filled up with people saluting the swastika. Anyway, let's just talk about the American bourgeoisie. Yes, it ended up against Germany once the war started, but let's talk about their proclivities.
Yes, exactly. And the narrative around the US's involvement in World War II as being the good war, the war against fascism, etc., is so misguided because it misrepresents both the lead up to the war and the fact that the US and the other bourgeois democracies of the West were not interested in forming a common front against fascism. On the contrary. And the Soviets, of course, were reaching out to the West and trying to do anything that they could to keep fascism at bay. The financial backers, of course, also included the major elements in the US corporatocracy. Ford is the most famous because, of course, he was awarded the highest medal of distinction for a foreigner by the Nazi government, and they awarded Mussolini the same award the exact same year. And so it's misguided to think that somehow the capitalist ruling class or the political elite within the United States was opposed to Nazism and fascism into the lead up to the war. In fact, President Truman had said, well, let's just wait and let Germany and Soviet Union battle it out, and then we'll kind of jump in at the last second in order to support who's ever winning, and that way we make sure they massacre, one another as much as possible. And in many ways, that's kind of what happened in World War II. Uh, the US ruling class was convinced, like the ruling class in the other bourgeois democracies, that the Nazi war machine was going to destroy the Soviet Union and finally get the job done, because it's exactly what they tried to do, 14 capitalist countries between 1918 and 1920, to strangle the red babe in its crib, according to Winston Churchill. They did not succeed in doing that. So Nazism, for certain members of the global capitalist ruling class, was the final solution to this form of class warfare. The US did get involved in the war, though, after the Red Army, to the surprise of so many people at the time, started winning against the Nazi war machine, the undefeated Nazi war machine, and the most powerful war machine in the history of humanity at that point in time. And it not only started winning, it started marching westward. And so the threat was that since the bourgeois democracies were not preserving the population against fascism, that the socialists and the communists from the East would bring a true liberation not only from fascism, but also from the very roots of fascism, and that is the capitalist system. That could not be allowed to occur. Hence the necessity of the US intervention and the opening up of the Western Front 2 years later. And so that larger history is so important to know, along with the fact that the US and particularly the intelligence community was trying to negotiate deals with the Nazis, particularly Alan Dulles in Switzerland, in order to sign a peace agreement with the West so that he could release, or unleash the full force of the Nazi war machine on the Soviets. So all of this deeper history is very important to know, as well as the recuperation of so many members of the Nazi high command and the fascist high command that were either redistributed to Latin America through the various rat lines that were run. Many of them were brought to the United States, like the 1,600 Nazi scientists brought in Operation Paperclip. Others were sent elsewhere in the world. The same thing happened in Japan, for that matter. So there's a lot more to discuss here, but I'll just leave it at that we really have to understand that the bourgeois state as it functions, right, it does provide certain limits against the unleashing of extreme fascist violence against particular sectors of the population, but it keeps fascism there within close reach, if not, actually put into power, in order to make sure that at the end of the day, the capitalist ruling class remains in power.
Claudia, you are in New York City, and New York City was.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. It's such an important part of this story because, unfortunately, so much of American politics is unbelievably provincial in the sense that it focuses on what's going on in the United States and turns a blind eye to a lot of what's going on elsewhere in the world, unless it's in order to weaponize certain issues like the rise of the Chinese economy or other such things. And so most American citizens or most people living in the United States don't even know that the US government, and this has been both Republican and Democratic administrations, has sought to overthrow, often successfully, more than 50 foreign governments since World War II, the majority of which were democratically elected. And so there is a deep history in this country of imperialism and the overthrowing of democratic popular governments in the name of supporting fascist dictatorships, authoritarian movements, anti-communist movements and shock troops around the world. And this is a bloody and horrible history that both the Republicans and Democrats have pursued conjointly. In fact, in one of the most telling statistics of the history of U.S. support of death squads and other such things around the world, John Stockwell, a former member of the CIA, with 13 other former members of the CIA, did a study, and they found that the U.S. was responsible, and the CIA more specifically, for the direct death of 6 million people between 1947 and 1987 when the study was conducted, right? So this is the scale that we're dealing with. I'd just like to relate that, though, back very quickly to your earlier exchange with Claudia, because I think it's also important that if the leaders of this movement, the financial backers, et cetera, are not prosecuted, then this means that the fascist threat is kept, right, within the confines of the bourgeois democracy, but it's always there, lurking in the margins, so to speak. And we have a precedent for this. The American Liberty League was organized in order to overthrow the US government, and we might get into this later in the conversation. But one important thing that happened, it was a proven conspiracy to overthrow the US government and establish a fascist dictatorship under when FDR was president. Did the Democrats prosecute? Did they go after the leaders of these movements? No, they found that there was a conspiracy to overthrow the US government and establish a fascist dictatorship, but they did not prosecute the leaders. They did not go after the financial backers. And the Liberty League, lo and behold, continued after 1934 and ran a Republican candidate for the next election against FDR. And that Republican candidate has been described by the great Grace Hutchins as being nothing less than a fascist. So this aspect of the narrative is very important for progressives to understand so that they're not hoodwinked by the false narratives of the Democratic Party, which is ultimately a bourgeois party and a party of the capitalist ruling class.
Yeah, very important points. Claudia, I know that you, in your everyday work, our bureaucracy actually happened.
That's absolutely right, Brian. And it's so important that you're pointing this out because the Nazi war machine and the Nazi state itself was in many ways modeled off of the United States. And if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler points out quite explicitly that the state that has made the most progress in the direction that the Third Reich was headed in is the United States. And so there's a direct series of connections. In fact, he considered the Wild, Wild East to be the Nazis' equivalent to the US's Wild, Wild West. So just as the US settler colony was expanding its genocidal war against the indigenous population, the Mexican population, and subjecting Africans to chattel slavery and death, as you just pointed out, that whole war, the colonial war, was precisely what Hitler undertook against the savage barbarians of the East, right? And in particular, those in the Soviet Union, who are identified as part of this Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy against the very principles of Western civilization. And so that history is very important to know, and it's one of the reasons that I think that the category of fascism, it's helpful to relate the category of fascism to kind of two different levels of analysis. And at one level, one very general sense, there's a fascist element to the history of capitalist colonial expansion. What I mean by that is that the capitalist ruling class used the state and vigilantes, militias, etc., in order to impose by force on the populations of the world exploitative and oppressive relationships of the capitalist system. And so the great Aimé Césaire pointed this out, right? We used to build concentration camps in the colonies. Everyone was fine with that. They start getting bent out of shape when it starts happening in Europe with the Nazis, right? But that being said, it is also important, if you're going to do conjunctural analysis, to highlight some of the specificities of what happened in the early 20th century. And so one of the lead ups to what happened then was the financial crisis of the capitalist system, and the fact that many people around the world were recognizing that capitalism wasn't working for the masses of humanity. And this was coupled with the fact that in 1917, there was the first successful, workers' revolution that established a workers' state. And so capitalism had a very clear alternative. And so one way of understanding the specificity of fascism as it conjuncturally emerges in Europe in the early 20th century is, at least in part, a reaction formation to the ideological and economic crisis of the capitalist world, coupled with the threat of an alternative system, meaning a socialist system. And so capitalism had to go on the warpath. And that's why the capitalist ruling class funded the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and wanted him, as he did, particularly in the case of Hitler, to unleash the war of wars on the Soviet Union, on the greatest threat to the capitalist system at that point in time.
Gabriel, let me just stay with you for a second about what actually happened in the 1930s. The U.S. obviously went to war against Nazi Germany, and at the end of the war, proclaimed that the victory against fascism was a triumph of bourgeois democracy. They didn't call it bourgeois democracy, of course. A triumph of democracy in America. But I know I've read your writings, and I know that you and Claudia have discussed this and taught about this. The U.S. ruling class was pretty pro-German when Hitler took over. And Hitler didn't seize power in 1933. There wasn't a Nazi revolution or a Nazi even counter-revolution. He was appointed. He was appointed by right-center political forces within the German capitalist establishment who had myriad ties with the Bush family, the Kennedy family, Henry Ford. And a lot of the U.S. bourgeoisie looked at Germany as a way to regiment and discipline or to destroy the growing labor movement of the 1930s. There wasn't like a profound anti-fascism within the American bourgeoisie. And of course, in Madison Square Garden in 1939, this was in New York, not Montgomery, Alabama, New York City. The garden was filled up with people saluting the swastika. Anyway, let's just talk about the American bourgeoisie. Yes, it ended up against Germany once the war started, but let's talk about their proclivities.
Yes, exactly. And the narrative around the U.S.'s involvement in World War II as being the good war, the war against fascism, etc., is so misguided because it misrepresents both the lead up to the war and the fact that the U.S. and the other bourgeois democracies of the West were not interested in forming a common front against fascism. On the contrary. And the Soviets, of course, were reaching out to the West and trying to do anything that they could to keep fascism at bay. The financial backers, of course, also included the major elements in the U.S. corporatocracy. Ford is the most famous because, of course, he was awarded the highest medal of distinction for a foreigner by the Nazi government, and they awarded Mussolini the same award the exact same year. And so it's misguided to think that somehow the capitalist ruling class or the political elite within the United States was opposed to Nazism and fascism into the lead up to the war. In fact, President Truman had said, well, let's just wait and let Germany and Soviet Union battle it out, and then we'll kind of jump in at the last second in order to support who's ever winning, and that way we make sure they massacre, one another as much as possible. And in many ways, that's kind of what happened in World War II. The U.S. ruling class was convinced, like the ruling class in the other bourgeois democracies, that the Nazi war machine was going to destroy the Soviet Union and finally get the job done, because it's exactly what they tried to do, 14 capitalist countries between 1918 and 1920, to strangle the red babe in its crib, according to Winston Churchill. They did not succeed in doing that. So Nazism, for certain members of the global capitalist ruling class, was the final solution to this form of class warfare. The U.S. did get involved in the war, though, after the Red Army, to the surprise of so many people at the time, started winning against the Nazi war machine, the undefeated Nazi war machine, and the most powerful war machine in the history of humanity at that point in time. And it not only started winning, it started marching westward. And so the threat was that since the bourgeois democracies were not preserving the population against fascism, that the socialists and the communists from the East would bring a true liberation not only from fascism, but also from the very roots of fascism, and that is the capitalist system. That could not be allowed to occur. Hence the necessity of the US intervention and the opening up of the Western Front 2 years later. And so that larger history is so important to know, along with the fact that the US, and particularly the intelligence community, was trying to negotiate deals with the Nazis, particularly Alan Dulles in Switzerland, in order to sign a peace agreement with the West so that he could release, or unleash the full force of the Nazi war machine on the Soviets. So all of this deeper history is very important to know, as well as the recuperation of so many members of the Nazi high command and the fascist high command that were either redistributed to Latin America through the various rat lines that were run. Many of them were brought to the United States, like the 1,600 Nazi scientists brought in Operation Paperclip. Others were sent elsewhere in the world. The same thing happened in Japan, for that matter. So there's a lot more to discuss here, but I'll just leave it at that we really have to understand that the bourgeois state as it functions, right, it does provide certain limits against the unleashing of extreme fascist violence against particular sectors of the population, but it keeps fascism there within close reach, if not, actually put into power, in order to make sure that at the end of the day, the capitalist ruling class remains in power.
Well, thank you, Brian. Yes, I agree that the Dulles brothers and many others of the political and economic elite in the United States admired what was going on in Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy and in Japan, for that matter, and really did support that project and were against the U.S. entering the war on the side of the Soviet Union. Alan Dulles is on record as saying as much. We're fighting the wrong enemy because the Nazis are Aryan, pro-Christian, and most importantly, pro-capitalist like us, and unlike the Bolsheviks or the Soviet Union. And the Nazis returned the admiration, right? The Nazis actually, they studied the US legal system, and Hitler explained that the form of racial apartheid operative in the United States was the most advanced form of white supremacy, and they modeled some of the legislation and the state building project of Nazi Germany on the United States, right? There's an interesting book from a liberal perspective called The Nazis' American Model. It has its limitations, but it goes into some of these details. But to frame kind of a lot of the issues that you highlighted in a way that I have found helpful, I would say that one of the things that's operative under bourgeois democracy is that there are different modes of governance, meaning different populations are governed in very different ways. And so if you're a member of the middle class or upper middle class, you'll most likely governed by a bourgeois democracy. You have rights that are more or less respected and other such things, as long as you don't get politically out of line. But if you look at the history of bourgeois democracies like the United States, of course, you also have other populations that are targeted for constant harassment, violence, incarceration, death, vigilante violence, and other such things. So fascism has functioned as a kind of parallel mode of governance for poor working class communities, racialized communities, and insurgent kind of socialist communities. And the history of the Ku Klux Klan and the other organizations that you touched on, Proud Boys and other organizations today, should give us pause to think, well, does the entire US population live in a bourgeois democracy, or are there only certain class sectors that are able to be protected by the rights of bourgeois democracy, and others that are targeted for elimination in various ways? And the same thing goes for the relationship between the national and the international context. And this is maybe a good point to conclude on. And that is that many people think, well, the United States is a bourgeois democracy. It's not fascist. But then look at the foreign policy, right? The United States, since World War II, has sought to overthrow some 50 foreign governments. And it has worked, many of them democratically elected. It has worked with fascist militias, death squads, propped up dictators, and other such things. So it's very naive to think that, well, the United States is a bourgeois democracy. Obviously, I was just saying it's not really just domestically, because there's these fascist modes of governance, but it's also internationally. It deploys these fascist modes of governance in order to tame the global working class and force them into abiding by the agenda of, that's pushed by the United States. And of course, and this is really my final word, of course, what all of this means is that we can't simply support bourgeois democracy against fascism, because they're two different modes of governance operative under the same socioeconomic system, which is capitalism. So we need to go to the root causes of these social and political systems. And to root out fascism, we not only have to root out the fascists and the fascist organizations, we also have to root out the elements in bourgeois democracy that aid and abet them. And we have to change the socioeconomic system. And under socialism, you have a system in which you don't have, of course, you have external, interventions and the attempt to support ultranationalist movements and things like that within actually existing socialist countries. But the socialist platform is not one that allows for, that fosters and aids and abets these forms of this mode of governance in which you target particular populations for discipline, for punishment, and for elimination. So if we want to be serious about fighting fascism, we need to do it internationally, and we have to do it on a positive project of seeking to establish socialism as the only alternative to the system that we currently have, which aids and abets fascism in various ways.
Fascism is a concept in class struggle. There's no essence to fascism, there's no universal definition that all parties would agree to, but it is instead a site of struggle that is extremely important because of the tensions operative between the dominant concept of fascism, which Helmut Harry was talking about in his opening comments, which is the bourgeois concept of fascism, versus a conceptualization of fascism that actually roots it in the political economy of the capitalist world system. And regarding the bourgeois concept of fascism, I think it's important that one of the dominant tendencies is idealism, that fascism amounts to a system of bad ideas, to microaggressions, to moral corruption. All of this basically guts the material reality of fascism and its connections to the economic forces that are driving it, and instead places fascism on an idealist terrain, just like the quote from Foucault that Helmut Harry just read, and the work of Deleuze for that matter, which ultimately means that if you want to fight fascism, it's a battle of ideas, usually waged within your own mind. And of course, Foucault, in some of his later interviews, said, well, his definition of liberation was self-liberation. It was knowing oneself. So the idealist project of clarifying one's own ideas is supposed to somehow miraculously keep fascism at bay. You could also think of all of the myriad discourses on totalitarianism that have been marshaled by French theory and by German-style critical theory that consist in saying that fascism comes from a bad way of thinking, from trying to think the totality, by trying to explain things, trying to develop science. All of this is just bad because it's totalizing, and the word totalizing happens to share an etymological root with totalitarian. Therefore, you can engage in a kind of metaphorical thinking and assume that they go together. And if you think in a fragmented way in which you don't see the totality, somehow you're struggling against fascism. Obviously, in the world that we're living in, this is more than laughable. Another aspect of the bourgeois concept of fascism is its insistence that fascism is fundamentally a cultural phenomenon. So fascism is then described as, for instance, or reduced to things like anti-Semitism, things like a set of cultural symbols and orientations, if they be swastikas or jackboots or other such things. And what this does is it invisibilizes the material practices of fascism that don't abide by the same cultural codes that the bourgeois history of fascism has affiliated fascism with. So you can't, for instance, see fascism operative in a state, a settler colonial state like Israel. You couldn't see fascism in the Ukraine because, as many liberals have argued, Zelensky has Jewish ancestry or roots in the history of Judaism. Or, for instance, you couldn't see fascism operative in Islamic fundamentalism because it is of a different cultural configuration. By looking only at the superstructural or cultural level, what the bourgeois concept of fascism then ultimately does is it evacuates the material forces that are actually driving fascism as a force of capitalist governance. And so the historical materialist approach recognizes that fascism is driven by the base. In the great words of Michael Parenti, he said that fascism is the final solution to class struggle. It is when class struggle reaches a fever pitch and the elements that are the fascistic elements operative under capitalism are given full control of the state apparatus in order to wage what amounted to, in the case of Nazi Germany, for instance, a genocidal war on socialism. The second point that I'd like to make is that in order to understand fascism from a materialist vantage point, I think it's extremely important to develop a multi-scalar analysis. And a multi-scalar analysis looks at different levels at which fascistic practices have operated historically. The bourgeois concept of fascism, as I touch on in the article that we pre-circulated, often traffics in an ideology of fascist exceptionalism. Fascism is this extraordinary thing that appeared maybe only one time or twice in Mussolini and Hitler, and thank God, the US democratic forces were there to defeat it, and it's been held at bay. Or it is manifest in kind of gross personalities like Donald Trump, and therefore we should line up on the Biden administration, and that will save us from fascism. What this does is it reduces the complexity and the different scales at which fascism operates to something very idiosyncratic, exceptional, and a break with the normal order. A multi-scalar approach takes a very, very different perspective on this. And in my own work, I've distinguished basically between three different levels. And these are heuristic distinctions. So they're not distinctions that exist, actually ontologically in the real world, but they allow us to see certain things. So fascism can be understood conjuncturally, meaning in a very specific space-time, you can look at the manifestation of fascist practices, like in Germany in 1933, or in the United States in 2023, or in France in 2023, like the fascist bands that have been roaming the streets during the most recent riots that are going on. But fascism can also be analyzed at a structural level. And one of the most important things I think that people need to see is that if you only look at conjuncturally and assume that fascism rose in Germany and Italy and that was kind of it, what that erases is that there was a structural crisis in the history of capitalism and the threat of an alternative system, which was a socialist system with the Soviet Union, and that in the wake of the Great Depression, there were fascist movements in every single capitalist country. So structurally speaking, fascism is something that emerges and is given full force within capitalist states when they're in moments of crisis. The highest level, though, of analysis is systemic. And so the term and concept fascism, of course, emerged in Italy in the interwar period. Mussolini himself said very clearly, we don't have an operative definition of fascism. Fascism was first and foremost a movement, an activity. It morphed and changed very significantly. If you know the history of Mussolini's politics, he kind of had a foot in each camp in which he wanted to keep a kind of fascism that was a parliamentary fascism on the one hand, and then the black shirts and the terroristic bands on the other hand. He had to consolidate that at one point in time, but he was doing a balancing act between what Gramsci called the two faces of fascism. If you only reduce fascism, though, to these forms, and assume that when the word emerged, it somehow necessarily referred to a new ontological reality, like a new thing that existed that hadn't existed prior to that point in time, then you erase the deep history of capitalist violence by state and parastate forces that imposed capitalist social relations by any means necessary, and that share the fundamental material attributes of fascism. So if it be the militias that were run against the indigenous population on the part of the US colonial regime, if it be the deep history of the Ku Klux Klan, or of, for that matter, death squads across Latin America, those types of practices need to be understood in terms of the deep history of fascism, if we understand by that the systemic nature of capitalist rule that has engaged in the most heinous and violent forms of colonialism and imperialism. So we have to be able to see colonial violence as akin to what would later become, in a more conjunctural and more specific form, fascism in the interwar period. And if you know anything about history, this is actually crystal clear, because Hitler modeled his colonial campaign, because it was a colonial campaign, on the East, on the US settler colonial rampage against the West, the Wild West was to the US settler colony, the East was to the Nazi regime. And he's crystal clear about this, right? And so if Hitler's saying it, we should understand that he actually means it because he's drawing on that colonial heritage in order to extend it against the true enemy of capitalism, and that is socialism. The third point that I wanted to make is that, and I'm not going to go into any detail about this because I think it'll come up in the conversation, I've also written extensively on it, is that one of the objectives of the bourgeois concept of fascism is to create an ideology of false antagonisms. And that ideology is one in which we are encouraged to struggle against fascism by embracing liberalism. And one could extend that, in the case of what Helmut Harry was saying a moment ago, to various forms of libertarianism, anarchism, other kind of political ideologies that ultimately share quite a bit with the core of liberal ideology. We've seen this, of course, very recently in US politics with the major media campaign saying that you had to vote for Biden because he was a bulwark against Trump. And anyone paying attention to geopolitics should have a very clear idea of how that project has worked out, because now Biden is funding to the tune of millions and millions of dollars fascist regimes or fascist brigades in the Ukraine, and for that matter, continuing just US imperialism around the world. And if you look at the history of liberalism's relationship to fascism, the true history of that relationship is that they've been partners in capitalist crime. There's differences, and I think we'll talk about some of these differences, between living under a liberal state and living under the terrorist dictatorship of fascists when they seize state power. That's a very important difference, and I think we're going to unpack it, hopefully, in the rest of the conversation. But at the same time, that difference is a difference in modalities of capitalist rule. It's not the difference between fascism and non-fascism. And proof thereof is the endless series of discourses on the part of liberals concerning the need to be tolerant of fascists, to listen to them, to give them a platform, to not exclude them from the debate. But why is that? It's because ultimately, as Obama, the former president of the United States, said explicitly about Donald Trump when he was elected, they're playing on the same team. What team is that? It's Team Capital. And the liberals need to keep the fascists in the wings, because if they can't maintain capitalist rule through hegemony, through rule by consent, they need people who are able and willing to do the dirty work. And they've done that systematically through history, and I'd be happy to share multiple different examples of precisely this phenomenon. This is one of the reasons, and this is the fourth point that I wanted to highlight, that I think that a logic that is very helpful for understanding how liberalism and fascism relate to one another, if you push back against the bourgeois conceptualization of fascism, is as the good cop and bad cop of capitalist rule. The good cop, as we know, is going to bring you a cup of coffee, allow you to make a phone call, ask you questions nicely, and say, look, I don't want this other guy to come in and start roughing you up, and we know where your family lives, and so why don't you just turn over the information and allow me to rule you by your own consent. That's the liberal mode of governance. Metaphorically, of course, it's more complicated than that, but it allows us to see something. The bad cop is brought in when people aren't easily ruled by consent. And the bad cop's going to bring it in, the muscle, rough people up, and make sure that at the end of the day, the job gets done. But what's essential for people to see is that the good cop and bad cop play on the same team. It's not because someone engages in liberal tolerance and says very nice things and is a good public speaker like Obama was, that somehow the policies and the practices are radically different than what you see under a Trump or someone else for that matter. And so the good cop and the bad cop are both policing the general population, one through hegemony, rule by consent, one through repression, but they're trying to do the same fundamental thing. And if you look at history, and I was glad that Helmut Harry mentioned Jennifer's important piece on this, as well as in your book, you deal quite extensively with this, that the history of capitalist rule is one in which one will toggle back and forth in different ways between modalities of repression and modalities of hegemonic rule. And so in my own work, I've developed a kind of conceptual framework of dual modes of governance. George Jackson, again, who Helmut Harry referenced here, is so important in this regard because there are certain populations that are quite clearly principally ruled by repressive state and parastate, meaning parallel to the state, forms of violence. If you look at the indigenous population in the United States, you look at the immigrant population in the United States, you look at the African American population, you look at many other examples, basically, of poor, working class, racialized groups. The principal modality of governance is very much one of mobilizing state and parastate violence to make sure that capitalist social relations are imposed by any means necessary. If you look at the professional managerial class stratum, and those who are largely kind of participate in the general kind of charade of liberal governance, they tend to be ruled by consent. In that regard, once you see the dual modes of governance, you can see that the good cop and bad cop aren't simply alternating. In certain cases they do, and Jennifer's pointed out this very poignantly in her work on Latin American politics, when there are moments when the dictatorships beat back and crush the working class to such an extent that it then actually made sense at the level of a cost-benefit analysis to bring back democracy, because there was no longer the threat of socialism. And so if it's toggling back and forth chronologically, or using these two modes of governance simultaneously, I think we have to kind of peel the bourgeois scales from our eyes in order to see the more profound mechanisms operative in the history of capitalism. The fifth point that I'll highlight, and I'll leave it at this, because I've done quite a bit of research on this, is that the dominant historiographical account that we have of fascism within the larger imperial. So the fifth and final point is that the dominant history of fascism that is put forth within the Imperial Academy, and for that matter within the imperialist core in general, is that fascism is this exceptional modality that emerged, and that liberalism is the bulwark against it, and so that the history is one in which there were these breaks at certain moments in time, but that the US defeated Nazism, and therefore now we have democratic rule. If you actually know the history not only of the spectacle of the US state, but of the US national security state, it's a very, very different story. Truman, the president at the time when the United States was having a debate over whether or not to enter World War II, is on record saying, well, if the Soviets are winning, we should maybe enter on their side. If the Nazis, maybe we should enter on their side. He basically wanted to make sure that there was bloodletting on the part of the principal axis in World War II, which was the battle between fascism and socialism. During that very same time, Allen Dulles, who would become the very famous head of the Central Intelligence Agency in the wake of World War II, but was an operative in the OSS working in Switzerland at that point in time, was regularly meeting with Nazi officials with plans to sign an agreement with the high Nazi leadership, those who were just under Hitler, in order to sign a pact with the West so the full force of the Nazi war machine could be unleashed in the East. Because that was the plan. The World War II was primarily about the attempt to finish the job that the 14 capitalist countries that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1918 had failed to accomplish. This is one of the reasons that the capitalist ruling class, not only in Germany and Italy, but internationally, the likes of Ford and DuPont and Morgan and others, funded the rise of fascism within Europe. In that regard, then, it's not only during the war, but in the wake of the war, the Central Intelligence Agency discreetly but forcefully integrated an incredible number of Nazis, Italian fascists, and Japanese fascists, both into their own modalities of governance. 10,000 Nazis, according to Eric Lichtblau, were brought to the United States in the wake of World War II. And in addition to that, there were the 1,600 that were brought who were Hitler's doctors of death, the scientists who were brought and given university positions at 14 different universities in the United States. But they did the exact same thing in Germany and in Italy, setting up as the head of the intelligence services in Germany a man by the name of Reinhard Gehlen, who had overseen the intelligence services of the Nazi Third Reich that was directed against the Soviet Union, and he proceeded to then stock the intelligence services in Germany with Nazis. Exact same thing happened in Italy with Operation Sunrise, and if you know anything about the history of Japan, it's incredible. In the case of Japan, they were just so crass and so open about it that they took the man who had issued the declaration of war against the United States, Nobusuke Kishi, brought him to CIA headquarters, or trained him within the Central Intelligence Agency, along with the other fascists, and he was the man who had overseen as well the colonial project of the Japanese in China, and then redeployed him, set up the Liberal Party in Japan, and he became the Prime Minister of Japan in the wake of World War II. And so, and this is not even to mention Plan Condor and all of the Nazis who were given free passage to Latin America through the rat lines that were set up. Klaus Barbie is the most famous, but there were many, many others. And so the true history of the relationship between liberalism and fascism, if we only look at the conjunctural manifestation of fascism in Japan, Italy, and Germany, is that liberalism didn't defeat it. It discreetly redeployed it in a veritable fascist international that was continuing the same war that Hitler was undertaking and the same war that had been waged by the 14 capitalist countries against the Soviet Union. That's the war on socialism. That gives us a very different portrait of how fascism has operated historically, but it also raises a fundamental question, and I'll leave this will be my final statement, and that is that in the case of the final solution in Nazi Germany, there was a moment in time at which the Nazis became very explicit about what they were doing, killing, at least according to some counts, 6 million people in gas chambers, and they were planning to kill 60 million of the Slavic slaves in the East. That was the plan. It didn't work out. And it didn't work out for one primary reason, and that is the Red Army, which gave 27 million people, as well as the 20 million Chinese who were killed in World War II. The war was in the East. 80% of the Nazi war machine was waged in the East, or was deployed in the East. And so it raised a question about the specificity of the bourgeois state in the form that it takes, in particular within the United States. And one of the things that the United States has been incredibly good at is the development of an extremely powerful cultural apparatus. Again, this is the system of production, distribution, and consumption of culture that provides such a powerful veil that the fascist international that I just mentioned, I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of this, but to some people in the room it's probably somewhat surprising. That should be common knowledge. It's part of the public record. There is an unbelievable level of documentation that is crystal clear on this front. The fact that the overwhelming majority of people are not aware of this is largely due to the power of the US-driven cultural apparatus to create a spectacle of liberal governance in order to better maintain the fascist international. And so this raises fundamental questions about the functioning of the bourgeois state and the absolute centrality of culture in the world war on socialism. Of course, Dimitrov said this very clearly when he defined fascism as the open terrorist dictatorship of the most chauvinistic and imperialist elements of finance capital. And of course, finance capital is the driving mechanism behind imperialism, as Lenin and others have demonstrated quite cogently. And so there are elements, of course, of fascism. We talk about toxic masculinity, ultranationalism. There's a lot of different ideologies that are mobilized in order to recruit fascists and things like this. But every single fascist movement has been astroturfed by the capitalist forces that are operative behind them. You could look at, for instance, if anyone knows the famous business plot in the United States, in which in 1934 it was decided that they were going to set up a fascist dictatorship, and they sent a gentleman to study 4 different examples of fascism in Europe. They decided that La Croix de Feu, which is a fascist organization in France, was the best model, and this was funded by Morgan, DuPont, Rockefeller, Pew, and Mellon. Why did they fund it? Because they wanted to overthrow FDR, set up a fascist dictatorship so that they could maximize profits. And so absolutely 100%, it's the political economy that is driving fascism, not fascism as a cultural phenomenon or a superstructural element that is somehow driving the economy. And we have to see those operating in that way. For that matter, in the case of Ukraine, we know that Zelensky, right, the current president who abolished elections now, so basically the dictator of what is more or less a totalitarian state at this point in time, was funded, his rise to power was funded by the third richest man in the Ukraine, Kolomyosky, who also funds so many of the fascist battalions, and is someone who also has a controlling interest in the platform on which Zelensky's TV show was run. And so Zelensky in many ways is, a sock puppet who was trained as a speaker by playing in a TV show as the president of the Ukraine. And so the man is both funding the cultural apparatus and then funding the front figures while simultaneously funding the fascist battalions on the ground. In the name of what? In the name of the maximization of profits, right? And so we absolutely have to see that as integral to, and of course, there's so much work on this. Daniel Guérin's book on Big Business and Hitler, Jacques Powell's work, there's an enormous bibliography that documents this in great detail. The other two questions I'll touch on quickly. So how does one decide about the conjunctural, structural, and systemic levels at which one would analyze fascism? When I say that these are heuristic, what I mean by that is that they're helpful for distinguishing between different levels of analysis within a world that, of course, is much more complex than those levels of analysis. So they don't correspond to the world ontologically. And the issue of whether or not, for instance, the Modi government is fascist, or that Trump is a fascist, or you take a lot of other examples, right? Orban, or take your pick. These are complex issues because a lot of the ways in which fascism operates is that it is qualitatively differentiated based on the state in question. I think it is undoubted that Biden supports various forms of fascism internationally, and it's beyond question that there are fascistic dimensions or elements to many of the authoritarian regimes around the country, or around the world, I should say. Deciding whether or not, so there's a kind of difference of degree, if you will, often, rather than just a difference of kind. Like, it's fascist or it's not fascist. No, there's a lot of different degrees, and you have to look at the different levels. In the Ukraine currently, for instance, right sector and the parliamentary manifestations of fascism are microscopic. It's like 2.5%. So at the parliamentary level, there's not much fascism in that sense, but at the level of cultural fascism, the support of the fascist battalions, etc., it's very explicit. And so you need a multi-dimensional analysis of the different levels at which things operate, and ultimately this is going to be sorted out in class struggle. So someone mentioned the CPIM's position, for instance, on Modi. These are important decisions that are taken by parties based on a concrete analysis of a concrete situation in which the primacy of practice is the most essential. And if you decide that a particular government is fascist, there are consequences that are going to follow from that. What are the tactics to struggle against it? What are the strategies, etc.? And so we have to be, I think, very attentive to the need for those refined analyses on the inside. Regarding, just very quickly, the point on all of these questions were excellent. I've been jotting down a lot of things that I want to explore and learn, so thank you for the quality of them. Regarding pushing back against the cultural power of people like Snyder, Jason Stanley, and others like this, I do think it's very important to recognize that culture is a site of class struggle. Theory is a site of class struggle. We are hopefully engaging in it now. The scale at which we're engaging with it in it is not the scale of someone at Yale who has, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in an enormous set of contacts, but doing that is extremely important. Building institutional power so that you can do that much more effectively. It's by publishing houses, media platforms, institutions like the one that we have with the Critical Theory Workshop, a lot of other platforms, International Manifesto Group, Midwestern Marxists, lots of people who are doing interesting things. But what we really need to develop is an alternative cultural apparatus. And we are developing it. We just have to do it a lot more quickly and a lot more efficiently. And but we have to do it in under-resourced ways, right? Because we're not going to get finance capital to fund that. And we also have to support and recognize the central importance of socialist cultural apparatuses. And if it be, Cuba is a great example of it, but there are a lot of other great examples in which if you control the means of cultural production, the means of communication, you can operate at a much higher level than people who are trying to scrap things together on shoestring budgets in order to try to make a difference to some extent. And so I think there are different levels, if you will, at which we can organize the fight back. The idea of this conversation is not just to understand fascism, but to figure out how to practically struggle against it. We could do a whole session on this, but I do think there are a few tactics I'll highlight very quickly. The United Front is a tactic by which workers unite in spite of particular strategic differences that they might have against the rise of fascism. The Popular Front, of course, is another very important historical model in which various political parties, be they, liberal parties, social democratic parties, Marxist parties, or for that matter, even anarchist groups, would unite in order to defeat a common enemy. That has proven, that tactic, or those two tactics, the United and Popular Front, have proven to be extremely important. There's also the development of what's referred to as a Popular Front from below. A Popular Front from below, particularly in situations in which the leadership of particular political parties is recognized as thoroughly corrupt and thoroughly in bed with the fascists, the goal is to organize the members of those parties against the positions taken by the leadership. So to connect with the workers in those parties, not necessarily to have that mediated by the leadership. A few other quick tactics. One is the central importance of, and here I'll give a shout out to George Jackson, he referred to the development of revolutionary communes, to having a communist culture, a socialist culture, in which people are exposed to a different set of ideas, a different set of horizons, and very different modalities of interaction and practice. And so building communal spaces, political spaces, leveraging power for the working masses is absolutely essential. And cultural struggle. I am not of the school of those who say, well, someone has some fascist leanings or might even be fascist, therefore we should just exclude them entirely and not try to actually recruit them in various ways. Now, of course, this depends on the particular circumstances. I grew up in rural Kansas, and the majority of the people who I went to school with are pretty fascist leaning. They're white supremacist, and they have very right-wing views. The thing that's interesting in certain fascist orientations is that some of them are very correct about fundamental social problems. The fat cats are out to get us, the government is no good, we have to change the system in some radical way. You go through a long list. And those elements need to be taken seriously, but they need to be reframed and given an alternative gestalt. To say, yeah, you're absolutely right, the fat cats are out to get us, government's bad, but the reason for this and the overall framework that could actually explain the things that are frustrating you in your life is one that we can take from Marxism. I mean, you might not use that word because there's an affiliation with it. No, of course, I'll just add quickly to that, fascists with bats and machine guns, this is a different thing. I'm talking about people who show a certain ideological disposition toward fascism. The last thing that I would say is that ultimately all of these are tactics for defending against the growth of fascism. But what we always need to keep our eye on is the strategy. The only way of ultimately demolishing fascism is to develop socialism to such an extent that the capitalist system and the driving mechanisms behind the capitalist system, namely finance capital at this point in time, no longer exist. And so socialism is the ultimate solution to fascism, and we need to be able to agitate on that front. Stephen, you raised some excellent points. Of course, I won't be able to touch on all of them, but one thing that struck me in what you said is that if we use a different kind of spatial logic for our analysis, and this resonates with Julian's point that it's not one state, one mode of governance, right? But within a particular state, there are different sites of governance. The mass incarceration system in the United States, the detention system in the United States, the reservations that have been set up for the indigenous population, lots of other examples of this, are themselves, internally, they tend to operate in terms of fascist modes of governance for the people who are there. Therefore, we have to be able to see that there are institutions operative within the bourgeois state that are thoroughly fascist institutions, even though they operate within a state which maintains a kind of appearance of bourgeois, bourgeois parliamentary facade in various ways. The only other thing in relationship to the collectivity of socialism versus bourgeois individualism, there are certain fascist movements that have really mobilized and they fed off of a very false image of what socialism is in order to try to generate a quote-unquote collective project of regeneration and of renewal. Because people are hungry for something new and something different because their lives are crumbling and threatened by proletarianization. And so in that regard, there is a kind of faux collectivism that's often operative in fascist movements, just like there's a faux revolutionary dimension to so much of fascist organizing. Yeah, on Foucault, I've written a detailed piece on, he was a violent anti-communist in 1968, in the wake of 1968, because he was opposed to 68, because he was actually involved in the governmental commission that signed basically capitalist reforms, counter reforms of the university that sparked the student movement. In the wake of 68, he, like many other radical recuperators, saw the writing on the wall and said, well, apparently now it's fashionable to be lefty. And so there was a brief moment of flirtation with the kind of Maoist anarcho-communism that was very lucrative at the level of his career, because the way in which he was then marketed in the United States is as a man with a leather jacket and a megaphone who's somehow radical. He's not. Read his biographies. He's a violent anti-communist. That's a quote from his leading French biographer, Didier Eribon. And in the wake of 68, after the kind of his flirtation with radicalism burned out in the early 1970s, he not only returned to his earlier forms of violent anti-communism, he got fully on board with his closest political collaborator, who's André Glucksmann. Glucksmann was a Maoist in 68, and then was one of the intellectual and political leaders of the anti-totalitarian movement, and was an extremely powerful force in all of that. And so if Foucault was dedicated to some form of radical organizing in the sense of a radical change, or in the sense of collective organizing, it was organizing against the quote-unquote totalitarian regimes of the East and support for the dissident movements against actually existing socialism, right? So he wasn't only theoretically anti-communist, he was practically anti-communist. There's lots of examples that I could point to in that regard. So if his ethical practices are linked to a politics, those are the politics. The final point I think is really great, Iago, the multipolar the multipolar world as it's emerging. Is this weakening the grip of kind of fascism in various ways? Obviously, we'd have to go through a very concrete analysis of all of the different circumstances and look at them. But hopefully, if at least one thing has come out of this conversation, it's that we always have to think of fascism in relationship to imperialism. And this resonates with what we were talking about yesterday. And part of the project of the multipolar world.
One thing that the bourgeois approach to fascism does is that it assumes that it's primarily ideological, right? It's a set of bad ideas, poor dispositions, ways of feeling about the world, right? I saw recently people talking about the micro-fascist aggressions within ourselves and other such things. And so fascism is ideological, right? It's somehow not linked to the capitalist forces that drive ideologies. And the other thing that is very widespread is what I refer to as a kind of ideology of fascist exceptionalism. Fascism isn't structural, it's not systemic. It is instead something that is intermittent, that is a threat, and that has come about and been instantiated in very specific cases. Hitler, Mussolini, in the current moment, Trump as a threat. And so then it becomes singularized. And the reaction then on the part of those who want to struggle against fascism is we're trained that, well, it has to be ideological, right? We have to reject the politics of hate, join the so-called resistance by buying the New York Times or other consumer products for the professional managerial class. And we have no way of combating the more systemic elements because it's all individualized, and we can only then confront it as an enemy that has kind of intermittent faces as opposed to a systemic problem. The advantages of a historical materialist approach are many, but some of them consist in the fact that historical materialists will always identify the ways in which ideologies, such as the ideology of fascism, are rooted in a socioeconomic system. So one of the very first things that's extremely important about fascism is it is a product of the capitalist system. It did not exist, at least in its, in the forms that it takes today prior to capitalism. It also is a force that is operative in every capitalist country. And this is immediately visible in what some people refer to as European fascism or the classical fascist model that emerged in the interwar period, because you had capitalist movements in every single, you had fascist movements in every single capitalist country in the wake of the Great Depression, right? So there's a direct and structural link between capitalism and fascism. That's important as well because Of course, fascism is in part an ideology, it's in part a worldview, but it's a worldview that is anchored in a system, the capitalist system, that has different ways of managing the population to which it wants to subject capitalist social relations. One way of doing that is through liberal ideology and cultivating a politics of acquiescence, a politics of consent, right? You give the uh, particularly within the capitalist core, members of the professional managerial class or of the middle and upper classes certain rights and representation in government. And what you get back in return for that is rule by consent. But the more insurgent forms, the more insurgent elements within the working class, particularly within the international working class, if they can't be governed by consent, well, how do you get the job done, so to speak? And fascism is one of the key elements in the arsenal of the capitalist ruling class. If it can't rule through liberal ideology, then it uses fascist ideology and fascist practices in order to use, to speak simplistically, to use the stick instead of the carrot. This also means then that the response to fascism is very different. It's not about hating particular politicians for the gross things that they say, or comparing, particular politicians to Hitler or other such things. We need a systemic response to a systemic problem. And that systemic response is going to the roots of fascism. And given that the roots of fascism are the capitalist system, the only way of really dealing with and getting rid of fascism is to abolish capitalism. And that's one of the reasons you alluded to this a moment ago, but the writings that I've done on contemporary fascism, such as the situation in Ukraine, are so important because the era that we're living in spite of the fact people will sometimes use this vocabulary, it's not an era of neo-fascism or neo-Nazism. These things never went away. These are structural elements within the capitalist system that go through ebbs and flows. And I think it is true that in the current moment, there is an intensification of fascism and authoritarian modes of government globally. And so a final thing that I'd say is that historical materials can also begin to explain why that is the case, right? It's not just that people want to hate more, or they're more racist or xenophobic or other such things. No, it's the crisis of the capitalist system that through its neoliberal phase of accumulation beginning in the 1970s has not been able to resolve its internal conflicts. And so summing all of this up, I'll reference the great Michael Parenti, who gave perhaps the most succinct definition of fascism that I've come across, and that is that fascism is the final solution to class struggle. When the capitalists have their system that's crumbling, their political legitimacy that's withering away, and the threat of socialism, what do they resort to? They resort to mobilizing armies of petty bourgeois, unemployed, and lumpen proletariat in a war against the socialist movement globally, and with the goal of ultimately, and we saw this clearly in the case of Nazis, the Nazis genocidally eliminating those threats to the capitalist system.
The socialist project that has been struggling in fits and starts to emerge since 1917, at least in material form, is a project that is going to continue to galvanize, and I would anticipate increasingly galvanize people. But we have to look at that in a global perspective, because at the same time, what you clearly have within capitalist countries, particularly within the imperialist core, is a resurgence of fascism. And so with the crises of capitalism and the inability on the part of the ruling class to take care of these crises, because they're irresolvable ultimately, the propagandists, as well as the capitalist ruling class, have a well-known, tried and true solution to that. And that is to try to do a kind of bait and switch where they bait people into various fascist forms of politics that ultimately have the goal of shoring up the capitalist system and intensifying imperialism. And so in the US context, we also have very powerful fascist organizations, and we have a government and a capitalist ruling class that either work hand in glove with the fascists or at least accommodate and maintain their presence, because they always want to keep their bogeyman kind of on call for when push comes to shove and they need to crush the socialist alternative by any means necessary.
When you say fascist, like who would you define as the fascist organizations?
Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, the militia movement,
the white power movement, the Klan, of course, the deep history of one of the things that's interesting is when the Italian fascists first arrived on the scene, and then the term fascism was introduced into the English language via the Italian language. Many in the US recognized that the Italian fascists were simply a European version of the Klan, because they were pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, anti-socialist, and they were doing the vigilante work that was allowed by the government, when we're talking about the black shirts, for instance, in the exact same way that the KKK was often allowed to act with impunity on the part of organizations like the FBI or the police or other forms of law enforcement within the United States. And so I think there is a very well documented history of fascist organizations. The thing that's, I think, difficult but important to analyze is that fascism comes in many different forms. It's not just swastikas and jackboots. We have plenty of that. Look at the Ukraine or look elsewhere, or in the United States. Plenty of people with swastika tattoos here. But given that fascism often takes on ultra-nationalist forms, Dimitrov, the famous communist analyst of fascism, claimed that when fascism arrives in the United States, it will arrive draped in the American flag and singing hymns to patriotism, right? It'll all be about US exceptionalism, etc. It'd be MAGA, make America great again, right? Yeah. And so in that regard, there is a very important fascist movement in the United States. And in the wake of January 6th, with Biden coming into office, there was not a serious crackdown on these organizations. There was a kind of propaganda campaign and a need to at least do something. And so you have some of the heads of these organizations who just recently received prison terms going up to, I believe, between 15, maybe 18 years is the maximum sentence, which is about half of what the prosecutors were seeking. And the organizations have not been shut down and continue to operate, even though some of the leadership has run into some legal problems. So it's alive and well in the United States for sure. And a real danger, of course, to socialist organizing, because one of the main goals of fascism is to crush the real opponents of capitalism, who are the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, anyone basically who's on the hard left. Not amongst the Democrats and the Republicans, because I couldn't agree more that if you want to analyze fascism, you have to do it internationally. And you see this very clearly with the US undying support for what is basically a totalitarian regime in the Ukraine controlled by Zelensky, and the funding of fascist battalions that have been this funding has, and the battalions themselves has been extremely well documented. And so regardless of whether or not it's a Democrat or Republican who comes into office, US imperialism and the US support of fascism internationally will continue, right? So that's a negative. Regarding fascism domestically, I think that we have to, and George Jackson's a great analyst on this front, identify at least two different forms of fascism. One is just the nature of the US police state and the mass incarceration system, everything that goes into the kind of quote unquote legal fascism. And that will continue unabated. Again, whether or not it's a Democrat or a Republican, we see this very clearly with Biden's longstanding history of supporting racist policies, being involved in the mass incarceration system, et cetera, et cetera. The fascist movements are a third element to that, like the movements that were empowered by Trump that I mentioned a moment ago. If Trump, someone like DeSantis, comes into office, then we are looking at a significant uptick in that type of activity. And that means that I think it would be increasingly dangerous for various forms of organizing, whether or not it be, labor organizing or social movement organizing or other such things within the US context. And it also depends on what exactly that will look like over time, because fascists historically have come into, like full-blooded fascists have come into office largely as opportunists who have been bankrolled by the capitalist ruling class, or segments of the capitalist ruling class, who are looking to solve the problem of how to increase capitalist accumulation and beat back the socialist threat. And it's clear within the US context that there are segments of the capitalist ruling class that support a kind of fascist option, a more directly fascist option, in the sense of supporting presidential candidates that would support these fascist movements and potentially also increase the two other forms of fascism that I mentioned, both imperialist fascism and the kind of fascist police state. And so one of the conundrums right now, I think, for some of the capitalist ruling class is what to do when faced with the fact that you do have an empire that is facing various forms of decadence, meaning various ways in which it's kind of coming apart at the seams. How do you shore that up? Well, one of them is you look at historical examples and you follow them. And in fact, in 1934, this is exactly what a group of Democrats did who were anti-FDR. They collaborated with JP Morgan and a whole series of other members of the capitalist ruling class and they made plans for a fascist coup d'etat in which they studied Hitler, Mussolini, and examples of fascism within France. And we now know through the business plot, this is all part of the public record, that there was a conspiracy to establish a fascist dictatorship. That was the term that was used within the United States. And so we shouldn't think by any stretch of the imagination that somehow we're immune to these types of politics. In order to understand how fascism operates as a form of political management under capitalism, it is essential to undertake a dialectical analysis of the relationship between fascist ideologies and the economic base. The definition proposed in the theses of the 13th Executive Committee of the Communist International Plenum of December 1933 and made famous by George Dimitrov is perfectly in line with this orientation. Quote, fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital, end quote. We see here a clear-eyed understanding of how fascism, far from simply being a set of morally reprehensible ideas or actions, is ultimately grounded in imperialism. Driven by the economic base and funded by the most reactionary elements of the capitalist ruling class, fascism often seeks to mobilize certain sectors of the civilian population, primarily the petty bourgeoisie and the lumpen proletariat, and state forces in a process of national renewal via the intensification of imperialism and the radicalization of capitalism's colonial legacy. In the interwar period, it was characterized, among other things, by the violent expansion of imperialism on the part of the European latecomers to the colonial feast, Italy and Germany, as well as the imperial emergence of Japan in the East. I'm going to share with you my intertitles just to mark where we're headed. So, interwar fascism and imperialism. Italy, in order to secure access to cheap natural resources and labor pools, as well as markets, undertook a project of imperial expansion. By the outbreak of the First World War, it had already annexed Eritrea and Somalia, and it had wrested control of regions like modern-day Libya away from the Ottoman Empire. Mussolini's government undertook to increase the size of the Italian Empire, which it did by continuing to expand the borders of its colonies and forcibly seizing Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and modern-day Albania. This process continued at the outbreak of the Second World War with fascist Italy's invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. In the East, the Empire of the Rising Sun annexed various Manchuria and various regions in China, and it also took over Taiwan and turned Korea into a colony. Japan continued to expand its empire across Southeast Asia through the onset of the Second World War. The Nazi expansion across Europe is well known, but it is less widely acknowledged that its colonial undertaking in the East against the Soviet Union was modeled on the US's settler colonial project and its expansion to the West. Just as the United States had genocidally eliminated the indigenous population and sequestered survivors on reservations, Nazi Germany planned to use what it had learned about the dark arts of genocide in Europe against the Slavs in the East. According to Mika Dorom's 1965 documentary film, Triumph Over Violence, the 6 million sent to gas chambers in Europe was the warm-up routine for what was to be the elimination of 60 million people across the Soviet Union. The Nazis' imperial drive was not only for Lebensraum in the East, it was also, crucially, to eliminate the greatest enemy of imperialism, actually existing socialism. This, of course, is one of the major reasons why major segments of the capitalist ruling class financially back Hitler. I'll reference Jack Powell's excellent book on this topic since he's on the call, and we'll hear from him shortly. Next section, defeat and redeployment. One of the greatest ironies of the 20th century was that bourgeois democracies like those in the United Kingdom and the United States were compelled to ally with the Reds in the USSR in order to fend off Germany's bid to become the leading imperialist power by engulfing the former world leaders in imperialism, as well as Japan's attempt in the East to wrest control away from the West. It was the Reds who ultimately defeated the fascists, and all anti-fascists have an enormous debt to the 27 million Soviets and the 20 million Chinese who gave their fascism, we should never forget, was ultimately defeated by communism, since the heart of the Second World War was fought in the East. With the routing of Germany, Italy, and Japan, as well as the destruction of the former imperialist powers in Western Europe, the US emerged as the new leader of the imperialist camp. While its cultural apparatus projected an image of it as the leader of the free world, its national security state discreetly set about integrating fascists from around the world into a veritable imperialist international. To cite but a few revealing examples, the head of the Nazi intelligence service directed against the Soviets, Reinhard Gehlen, was recruited by the OSS and then continued under the CIA after the war, and then put in charge of the West German intelligence service, where he proceeded to hire thousands of his fellow Nazis. Yvanik Donuel explained this strategy with remarkable clarity. Quote, "It is hard to understand that as early as 1945, the Army and the US intelligence services recruited without qualms former Nazi criminals. The equation was, however, very simple at the time. The United States had just defeated the Nazis with the help of the Soviets. They henceforth planned to defeat the Soviets with the help of former Nazis," end quote. This included bringing 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States in Operation Paperclip, providing safe passage for some 10,000 other Nazis to the United States, stocking stay-behind armies across Europe with Nazis and Italian fascists in Operation Gladio, and running many through rat lines to Latin America to support US-backed dictatorships across the region. I've detailed this in a long article on the topic if anyone wants additional references in that regard. The same basic pattern that we saw in Nazi Germany is also visible in Italy, as attested to by Operation Sunrise and the CIA's recruitment of figures like the Black Prince, Valerio Borghese, to continue the fascist war on communism. In the case of Imperial Japan, its leaders were largely put right back in power by the United States. As the undisputed overseer of global imperialism, the US enlisted this international network of right-wing militants in its ongoing war on communism and its efforts to expand its imperium through the proliferation of dirty wars, terrorist and torture campaigns, concentration camps, and dictatorial regimes around the world. Victor Marchetti, a senior CIA official from 1955 to 1969, described the centrality of fascists to empire building in the following terms, quote, "We," meaning the CIA, "were supporting every half-assed dictator, military junta, oligarchy that existed in the Third World, as long as they promised to somehow maintain the status quo, which would of course be beneficial to US geopolitical interests, military interests, big business interests, and other special interests," end quote. The contemporary cutting edge of imperialism. Fascism has, at least in a certain sense, served as the cutting edge of imperialism, meaning the frontline struggle to expand empire and beat back socialist resistance, often through violent forms of so-called primitive accumulation, form of political management, when the drive for endless expansion encounters limits or threats thereof, including its own systemic crises of realization, socialism, and the power of organized labor. With this in mind, let us briefly consider two contemporary conflicts in order to see what light this insight can shed on them: Ukraine and Israel. According to the bourgeois concept of fascism, which dominates the mainstream media, neither of these could be considered fascist, either for culturalist reasons or because they maintain a semblance of bourgeois democracy as hollowed out as it is. In the case of Ukraine, liberals often assert that it cannot because of President Zelensky's Jewish heritage. They thereby confuse the content of certain fascist ideologies, anti-Semitism, with the universal form of fascism. However, fascism can have very different ideological contents depending on the circumstances, and these should not distract us from its general form. In the case of Ukraine, we have a government that has worked hand in glove with fascist militias that explicitly identify with the Banderite tradition of Nazi collaboration. These militias have played a key role in fighting the Russian separatists in the Donbass, who declared nation in reaction to the 2014 fascist Maidan coup fomented by the United States. In its ongoing efforts to quash this anti-fascist movement, the Zelensky government has banned political parties, thrown opposition leaders and communists in prison, control of the media, worked closely with fascist militias and integrated some of their forces into the National Guard, glorified ultranationalists and Nazi collaborators, empowered of fascism, and postponed elections. The primary force propelling the Donbass region and Russia is above and beyond Ukrainian oligarchs like Ihor Kolomoisky, the United States, which is using Ukraine as a proxy in its war against Russia and ultimately China. Although Russia is, of course, a capitalist country, it has pursued an autonomous path as of late, refusing to follow the dictates of the US imperium and instead asserting an agenda of national development, along with foreign policy interests that conflict with Washington. This means, in short, that it has created a number of obstacles to the development of US imperialism. In this regard, the fascist developments in Ukraine, in its war against Russia, can be seen as part of an attempt to expand imperialism and beat back oppositional forces. It is precisely because the US has branded its imperial expansion as the spread of democracy that the very idea that fascism might be at work in Ukraine has been mainstream Western media. Regarding Israel, it might be fascist or that fascist elements could be operative in the country is often considered in the West to be a logical impossibility because it is a Jewish state. The specific content of fascist ideologies varies considerably, however, and anti-Semitism or white supremacy, to take but two examples, are not requirements. In fact, these are only specific types of dehumanization, but there are plenty of others for different target populations. It is helpful in this regard to invoke Domenico Losordo's important distinction between naturalistic despecification and moral or political despecification. Both of these processes occur in moments of acute crisis. They involve, Losordo explained, the exclusion or expulsion of particular ethnic, social, or political groups from the valued community, the properly civilized group, even the human race, end quote. Despecificazione in Italian has the connotation of an exclusion from the species. The Third Reich, identifying its enemy as an entire race or people, relied on naturalistic despecification, which dominated the colonial tradition that it sought to resume and radicalize. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, quoting Losordo, despecification was invariably political, moral, not racial. Forced labor was not a hereditary condition, end quote. Exclusion from the community was based on moral and political choices, not purportedly unchangeable natural characteristics like race, religion, nationality, or ethnicity. Given what I briefly outlined, and I'm going to shortly conclude or soon conclude, regarding fascism's roots in the colonial project of expansion and the role it has often played as the cutting edge of imperialism, it is worth recalling that the Zionist movement that eventually led to the founding of Israel was explicitly conceived of as a colonial project. Theodore Herzl, the movement's preeminent leader, liaised with the racist symbol of British colonialism, Cecil Rhodes, about quote unquote something colonial, namely his project to use religion as a real estate deed to dispossess Palestinians. The Zionists received extensive backing by major forces in finance capital like the Rothschild oil and banking interests, and they secured the support of major imperialist powers. In return for their backing, they were guaranteed that the new state would serve their interests. Given Israel's geostrategic location and proximity to major oil and gas reserves, it was of great importance to the leading imperialist countries, and it also served as a geostrategic wedge against pan-Arab socialism. If we look at Israel's current assault on Gaza and the positions taken by the Israeli government, it is imperative to ask a question that has largely been excluded from mainstream Western media accounts. Is this a case of naturalistic despecification as a justification for colonial? The Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, has stated, quote, "It is an entire that is responsible." It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. We will fight until we break their backbone, end quote. The failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians is a war crime, according to international law. Nevertheless, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered a complete siege of Gaza in a clear act of collective punishment. Quote, no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals, end quote. Israeli army reservist Ezra Yachin understood his government's position perfectly well and harangued his fellow soldiers to, quote, erase them, their families, mothers, and children. These animals can no longer live. Every Jew with a weapon should go out and kill them. If you have an Arab neighbor, don't wait, go to his home and shoot him, end quote. Yachin, who is 95, has been touted in the Western press as Israel's oldest reservist. He has been around long enough to have had the remarkable record of having sought to ally not once, but twice with Hitler's Germany in order to have Nazi backing for his Zionist project of colonizing Palestine. As journalist Dan Cohen explained, Yachin, quote, was a member of the Lehi, the Zionist terrorist group that twice attempted to ally with Nazi Germany and sought to found a copycat fascist state, end quote. I don't have time to kind of get in and answer the question that I've raised, but it should, I think, give us all something to think about in reflecting on the relationship between fascism and imperialism in the current moment. And just to conclude, in order to understand the last century of fascism, it's imperative to situate it in relationship to imperialism. And although both of these phenomena are multifaceted, I hope it is now clear that at least one of the roles that fascism has played over the course of the last 100 years has been to serve as the cutting edge of imperialism, meaning the frontline war for its violent expansion and the beating back of socialism. It is a tool of political management under capitalism that is regularly deployed in order to subdue those populations that refuse to acquiesce to imperialism. While there are many tactics for fighting it, there is only one clear strategy, which consists in overcoming capitalism that is the driving force behind fascism and establishing socialism. Thank you very much.